Hello and welcome to NLNOG Live. We're very happy to be back with this second edition, and we have some really good presentations on the agenda. We have 9 actually this time. My name is Natalie Trenneman, and I would like to introduce the rest of the team to you. Today, Niels Rijen will be your host, so he will be taking care of all the questions you have for the speakers. Then we have Melchior Aalmans. He will do a presentation later in the day, and Job Snijders, who will be moderating a session, and Thomas de Loof, who takes care of all our finances. And then we have a team that we have behind the scenes, and that is, of course, the production crew, Sven and Denise, as usual. We're happy they're back this time with us again. And, of course, Anna Cox, who takes care of all our social media and marketing. This time, you might have seen that we have some really, really nice artwork, and this is done by the fabulous artist Natasha Allegri. So thanks for that. Today, we wouldn't be here without the help of our whole list of sponsors. We're super happy that they are with us and that they keep showing us support. We even have 2 new sponsors this time. So as you know, I'm going to read out the whole list of sponsors that we have. We're very happy to have Asteroid, Juniper Networks, Ripe NCC, M6, Solid Optics, KPN, NTT, Alterna, SpeedIX, PC Extreme, LoanApp, i3DNet, Duocast, NLNet Labs, Arista, NLAX, RETN, eBay Classifieds, Fusix Networks, OpenBSD Amsterdam, and Internet Society. A big thanks to them. As you know, at NLNOG events, we always ask everybody to treat each other with kindness and respect. This is no different. We have quite limited capabilities for interaction because it's a virtual event. But you can ask all your questions to the presenters on the YouTube chat and on the RFC channel. And then Niels will collect those questions and relay them to the presenter. It would really be helpful for Niels if you can state your question at the beginning with a capital Q, so he can find them in all the chat logs, and then he can relay them. There is a little bit of delay between the broadcast and the production, so don't wait with your questions until the very end. Just ask them as soon as you think of them. And then there's one final thing. After the sessions, we'll have a virtual bar. Unfortunately, it's bring your own drinks this time, but we hope you will join us in Gather Town, where you can find the link on the website of NLNOG. That's it for me. We have 10 speakers lined up for you today. The first presenter is Bert Hubert, and I personally think Bert should have his own TV or radio show. His interests range from DNS to DNA and from Galileo to viruses, but today we asked him to talk about something completely different, but it sparks a lot of discussion on the RFC channel every time. So here is the talk on career development and money. Have fun. Bert, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So I'll fire up because we don't have a lot of time. So today I'm going to talk about career development and money and how to be happy at work for the next 40 years. So that's a small order. If you're watching this from outside of the Netherlands or outside of Europe, you're probably going to find this a very strange presentation because this is unique for every individual country, and this is from a Dutch European IT perspective. This presentation is a follow-up to a presentation I did in 2015 called Escaping the Data Center. And if you're watching this back later, it might be very good to watch that presentation as well. So who am I? Why can I talk about career development and money? I've been hiring people since around the year 2000, and I've hired a lot of people. And I know a little bit how it works. I know how it works from the employer side, and I also know how it works from the employee side. And in this presentation, I'd like to share some of the things that I have learned. That does not mean that everything I say is true for everyone, but I've tried to make it such that it's true for many of you. So here are the limited goals for this presentation. I want you to have a good life. That means that you can do the things you need to do. I want you to enjoy work and also keep this up for the next 40 years until you can hopefully retire. And do that even if we have a pandemic and a recession and technology in the world that keeps changing. This kind of stuff does not happen without a plan, but career development is about as fun as discussing life insurance or pension plans, in the sense that we do not talk about this. And for the next 30 minutes, we are going to talk about it. And part of this may be uncomfortable. So I made a graph because we like graphs and we're technical. So this is a graph of jobs. And on the X axis, you see spiritual reward. Does this job make me happy? Is this job good? Is this job for me? And then on the Y axis is how much money am I actually making? Now, this is in euros. Don't get too hung up about the numbers that are there. I just meant them as an indication. And you can see the guy on the left with the X. He has a shitty job and shitty pay. He is on call all day long and everything is broken. And a lot of people have that job. It is shitty and it does not pay well. And if we then go up the graph, we see this guy, he's making 200,000 euros a year. He's sitting in the Saudi Arabian desert and he's doing internet security for a Saudi Arabian bank. And he makes a shitload of money, and every evening he sits in his air conditioned compound drinking fruit juice without friends. So that is a job that does not pay well, or that pays very well, but is actually not real fun. But it could still be the job that you need. And then there's a lot of people that are in the blue star on the right. They have a super comfortable job. Everything is nice. The parking space is nice. The plants are nice. The desk is nice, and the technology is nice, but the pay is shit. And that eventually also causes problems. And the goal of my presentation is to get you near the orange triangle, that it may be a slightly less comfortable job, but one that makes you more money. Or conversely, that you at least get away from the poor guy, the little red X that has the shitty job and the shitty pay. So what is even good work? Because some of us might have forgotten by now what is good work. It means you have supportive colleagues and a safe environment. What is a safe environment? That says I can criticize someone else and I will not get blamed for it, and I will not get harassed for it, and people will not make fun of me. What also helps is if you know that you have a job that somehow matters. So there are jobs that really do not really matter. So if you work in compliance, compliance in itself does not matter. Maybe having a safe working environment matters, but there are a lot of things that don't really matter that much. But you could also be working on keeping the communication platform for 100 million people alive so that they can do their job. Hey, that's nice. That's something that matters to people, and it helps. It's also fun if you actually have a job where from time to time you get something done. You can deploy a new platform, you can migrate things, you can enable new features. In many jobs, you will never actually really get something done because everyone is completely hung up on procedure and stuff, and maybe once a year something actually happens. Then there's, of course, the important part of enjoying the thing you actually do. So let's say you enjoy automation, then actually you get a good kick out of actually automating routers. It is nice if your job feels like a community, if it feels like you're working on something together and that people trust each other. It's a lot of fun if you learn something new once in a while. Then we come to the topic of bullshit. Every job comes with some bullshit. There are ridiculous meetings, there are silly procedures, there are forms to fill out, and there has to be a tolerable amount of bullshit. And then finally, and that's also really important, practical things. It is known from scientific studies that if you have a long commute, so you have to spend a lot of time to get to your actual work, that is physically bad for you. If you have to show up at 9 a.m. every day, no matter what, that is not helpful and does not make you happy. So why do I spend a lot of time on this slide? A lot of people I speak to are convinced that good work does not exist because they've not seen it in the past 10 years. And I'm here to remind you that actual good work exists, and that it's tremendous fun, and it's very satisfying if you actually have good work in a safe environment. So strive for that. What is a good material reward? So we're talking about money now. Well, people love to say money can't buy happiness. And that's usually said by people that have a lot of money. You have to realize money cannot compensate for a terrible job. If your job is terrible and to compensate they give you a lot of money, you now have a lot of money and a terrible life. So it doesn't help. However, and I've seen this a lot in my hiring work, if you have people that simply do not make enough money to live the kind of life that they want to live, that hurts. So if you live in a shitty house, if you think, oh, I could never afford to have children, or I could not have afford a second child, that makes you feel disrespected. Especially if you see other people in marketing and sales that are making good money and you are not making good money. That hurts. That really hurts, and it is real. Um, Another problem with not making enough money is that you cannot build up savings. Let's say you made enough money that you could save some money, then you would, for example, be able to say, hey, I'm going to try this new job. Maybe it doesn't work out, but it doesn't matter because I have enough money that I can live for a few months without pain. So that makes sure that you can actually move to a different job. If you do not get paid enough money, you can get trapped in your current job because you cannot afford to switch. Finally, money is also important during bad times when you simply must rake in the cash. You could get unlucky in life and just need a lot of money. For example, I mean, these are not happy examples, but through a divorce or whatever, or you made a bad investment, or your house burns down. There are lots of people that say, I'd rather be happy at work than make enough money. And this slide is here to tell you that it's not enough to just have comfortable work. Eventually, running out of money is also bad for you. Now, the goal of my presentation is to move you around a little bit. So if we kind of figure out where you are in the chart, at least you are going to figure out where you are in the chart. And let's hope over the years, we can move you around a little bit from a job that makes you happier, or maybe slightly less happy, but at work, but richer at home. And you see this ellipse there called lots of jobs here, and you see that actually, as the job gets worse, the pay goes up a little bit, and that it took me a while to understand that. When I was hiring people over at Fox IT, we found that people that worked at banks, they made far more money than we ever paid. And so we asked, how is this possible? And they said, well, actually, if you do not pay this kind of money, no one would do that job, because no one goes work at a bank because they love working at a bank. They go work at a bank because you actually have to get paid to be there. So there's actually sort of a trade-off that if a job pays a lot of money, there's also usually a significant downside to that job. So where are you on the chart? And this is an important one. This is an exercise you can do at home. This is an exercise you can do at work. And this is an exercise that the NLNOG community can help you with. What kind of money do you make? And what do your coworkers, what do your colleagues make? People lie about this. People do not talk about this. They will give a range. They say, well, I make enough money. But it's super important to figure out, what do your colleagues make? And also important, what do people that do similar work at other companies, what do they make? Now, it is not easy to figure that out because people are not very honest about this. They don't like to talk about it. But the NLNOG community can help. You can start comparing with your friends and say, look, what do they pay you? And you can ask your own coworkers, what do they pay you? And this allows you to find out, are you making good money, but maybe you don't realize that? Or maybe you are getting paid far too little and you don't realize that. So to get back to the graph, this is to figure out, are you at the sort of the high end, at the upper side of the graph, or are you at the bottom side of the graph? Then the left-right part. How good is your job? And it is tricky to figure that out because we tell each other a story that, yeah, the job is fine, every job is like this. It could not be better, or it could be a lot worse. And it's very worthwhile to go over this list. And I will not do this right now here because we would run out of time, but you can watch the presentation back later. This is a good checklist to figure out how nice is my job. One part is really important. That's bullshit. Every job has some aspects where you go like, yeah, this is just terrible. And the thing is, that's always going to be the case, because if the job were 100% fun you would be paying for it. And partially getting paid is sort of to compensate for the fact that some parts are just terrible. Here I have a lot more examples, and we're going to skip them. But a good one is also to figure out what percentage of time am I spending in my company being reorganized, acquired, split, merged, or sold. Um, um, so this is a good checklist. I want to really hammer home this point. If you, and I speak to some of you, especially younger people, that describe their job for me, where they say, yeah, I spend 3 hours in a car every day, and then I rack up servers, and maybe the next day I take them out of the rack again because someone changed their mind. Um, Bad work is very, very bad for your mental health. It turns you into a nasty person. If you get shit at work, you will be a shit person at home eventually. Um, if you have strange health problems like back pain or shoulder pain, headaches, and all kinds of things, a lot of that comes from bad work. Bad work is like really, really bad for you. Now, you might have started the job at 18, and back at 18 you could drink beer all day long and live on a diet of shawarma and chips, and that's fine. And I can tell you, when you get older, that no longer works. And in the same way, toxic environments and shitty work are something that are sort of easy to deal with when you're maybe 20. When you're 30, it starts to hurt. And by the time you're 40, your bad job is making you ill. So it is really important to pay attention. Is my job making my life better? Is it good for me or not? And the final point is like really important. After 15 years of having bad work, you might be convinced that good work does not exist, that it's fake news, and it's not worth trying to get good work because you cannot imagine that it exists. And I'm here to tell you, good work, rewarding work exists. It is worth striving for. So, now, some specific worries. And like I said, I have some groups of NLNOG members in mind that I know pretty well. And one of these group of people are people that are too comfortable in their job. So you found a job and it's nice, the chair is nice, the coffee is shitty, but you got used to it, you got your own coffee machine. And even though the job may not be perfect, we know it's okay, it's tolerable. And we remember the war stories from our previous job where our boss asked us to make IPv5 addresses and told us to just make more IPv4 addresses. And we like since so some people it's easy to get stuck in a sort of okay job and get stuck there for 20 years. Same goes for technology. Technology improves, technology change, technology also gets worse. It really does get worse. And I see a lot of people getting stuck and they have a favorite framework and it was like super nice in 2005. And it's actually still super nice. It still really works. But everyone is now busy with somewhere else. And you spend your time telling these other people that they're all wrong and that the Kubernetes it sucks because it cannot do what this Perl framework that I use has been doing since 1985. And you're probably right. But you're sort of digging a hole for yourself where you get ever more specialized in ever older technology. And it's hard to get out of that. So I have two worries. So I speak to some of you that have a well-paying job. It comes with a super nice car, and but the job is slowly killing you. So this mostly goes for the contractors, the data share people out there. And yeah, the job is nice, the money is nice, but you get shifted around from one place to the other place, and these are not actually good jobs because you never build up anything anywhere. And the pay is nice, but it's well, I'll get back to it later about some of the problems. And the one on the right is the too comfortable job, and that's the one I just described, where you sort of dig a hole for yourself and start telling you that this is all perfect until suddenly you are an expert in a framework that no one uses and your employer goes out of business. So, career development, what can we do? What can we do in the short term, like today? What can you do in the medium term? And what can you do in the longer term? Let's start with stuff that you could do today. Figure out what kind of employer do you have. And this is the most important part. Because if you get this wrong, then all the actions you could do in the next 6 months depend on this. many employers are actually sort of hate the fact that they have to employ technical people. And you can tell. You can tell if you go like, yeah, no one in our management understands what we do and they don't even care. And they often say, yeah, well, you say this is difficult, but I have an app for that on my phone. And that's a sign that your company does not really care about you and would love to just sell you. Um, the other place is, let's say you want to have a better job, but your employer really cannot afford to give you a better job because there is simply is no, you are not earning any money for the company. Then you can do whatever you want, but they're not going to be nicer to you. And this can be compared to a supermarket job where no matter how well you work, if you work at the supermarket, you will never make your supermarket more money by working harder. And they're also not going to reward you any extra because you're not selling any extra stuff. You're not making anything possible. But let's say you work at bol.com or Amazon or you work at Netflix and you enable millions of people to spend billions of euros at your employer, then it really pays for an employer to invest in you because if you do a better job, the Netflix is better, the streaming is better, everything is better. So you have to figure out, does my employer even care about me? Could they afford to treat me better? And if you find out that your employer really does not like you or cannot afford to treat you better, then it's useless to try to improve things at your current employer. So, money. I explained this one, so I'm going to skip most of it. But if you start comparing what you get paid within your own department, so you sit there and you get out the actual pay slips, the loonstrookjes or whatever, and you figure out how much does everyone get paid, you will typically find that some of you earn twice as much money as the rest. And that's always the case. I have seen many of these Excel sheets and these tables. And the thing is, if you find out who is making the most money, it is usually not the best person. It is usually someone that got hired at the right time. And now everyone is super, super duper angry because I've been working so hard at doing this upgrade and it's got to be smooth. And I worked all over the weekend and there is this other guy and he got hired 2 years later and he never shows up in the weekend and he makes twice as much as I do. And you will now be super angry. Okay, that's good. That is good. Because you have to use that anger. You have to figure out that, okay, someone is not treating me well and I'm being treated like shit and I'm going to change that stuff. So use that anger. Now, one of the hardest thing to do, but it's very important, if you want to improve the money you make, you have to have a credible threat that you're going to work somewhere else. And the only way to make that credible is to actually get another job offer. And you'll have to work on that. And this works like 1,000 times better than going to your manager and say, hey, I really need more money because Hank also gets more money. That doesn't work. You have to be credible and they have to worry that you're going to walk away. I'm going to skip this one because we're really running out of time. So some fun salary facts. Your employer will pay you as much as is needed to keep you around. And whenever someone new is getting hired, there's a huge random component in salaries. So when a new job gets shown, they will say, well, we're going to pay between X and Y 1,000 euros a year. But if a good candidate shows up, you can move that number around a lot. And it depends really on all kinds of random things. And this explains why you will find this one colleague, Hank, that gets paid twice as much as you do, and you don't understand why. Employers invent all kinds of bullshit to tell you that they cannot pay you more money. And some of the people you talk to might even believe the bullshit. So, 90% of the flexibility in salary is when you get hired. And this also explains why you need to look for a new job, because it's a lot easier to sort of move the needle there than when you sit there already. And because very often your boss will correctly derive that you are not actually going to leave. Because you sit there with a coffee cup with your name on it and you have your own plant and your own coffee machine, and it doesn't look like you're leaving. And that means that they're also not going to work to pay you more. Now, people invent all these kinds of bullshit rules, and I mentioned them here. There's salary scales that say, look, this job, we can only pay this amount of money in this job. Or you don't have the right diploma, or we're going to pay you like shit for the first 5 years. or the OPEX does not allow it. And please know, if an employer needs you to stay, they can pay whatever they want, because they're not going to let some kind of salary scale hold them back if they really need you. Final point is really important. Many people have found out that they're actually not getting paid what they should be getting paid. So either you started the company as an internship and you never really left, um, or they actually promised you a raise and it looked on your payslip that you actually got a raise, but it didn't actually happen. And they will never tell you about it. They will never come to you and say, hey, we figured out we've been underpaying you. Sorry, let us fix that. No, it's not going to happen. So you need to check that. Um, so the only way to really change salary is to change jobs. That's a lot of work. You can then go back to your own current employer and say, hey, I got this new offer and I can actually leave. Um, Sometimes you can actually sit there and figure out that you are not getting paid what you should be paid. And there is one final exception that you can use if you want to get paid more, but it only works sometimes. Let's say you show up at HR and say, look, I'm making this amount of money and I cannot afford to live anywhere near our office on this kind of money. And I also have a child on the way and I could never afford that. So you have to pay me more or I really have to leave. And that can be credible. But you really have to have that story. You really have to have the child on the way or not be able to live near your place of work. So, but you cannot just show up and say, hey, I would like to have more money because I'd like to have more money. It has to be credible. And it can be credible because you actually got a new job on the way or because you can really show that, look, I cannot afford to work here. Okay. Now the non-money parts, because like I said, the non-money parts are actually far more important than the money parts. In the short term, there's not a lot you can do. If you find that your place of employment is not too great, you cannot fix it too easily. Um, you could do some things about, can I work from home more, or can I work fewer hours but still keep the same pay? That sometimes work. If you have a big fancy company car that you don't actually need, you could say, well, can I just work 4 days a week and not get this car? Or you could try internally to switch departments, which at least sort of is new pain. But these are not very strong options. Finding a new job. Just realize you're not going to improve your employer from the inside. So if your work sucks and you're like, I'm going to fix my employer, it only works if you're senior management. And if you were senior management, you would not be listening to this presentation, I think. You would be asking me not to do this presentation then. The easiest way to fix your work environment is by finding a new job. The interesting thing is, even trying to find a new job is extremely good for you. But it's real work. Many of you have always rolled from one job to another. That's the economy. That has been the economy for the past 15 years. There are people say, yeah, I never have to work to find a new job. I just have to say yes to the offers that keep coming in. That's nice. One, that is not going to last. We're heading for a big recession. The automatic job offers are going to stop. And secondly, finding a good job is more work. So you really need to spend time on what you want from a job and what you have to offer to an employer and where you could improve. Finding a new job, just do it. Even trying it is good. I'm going to skip most of this, but really now work on a good CV with a dedicated version for every potential employer. People will send out terrible CVs. I know, because I receive a lot of terrible CVs. Please work on them. There is no excuse. So don't say, yeah, this is a CV I made earlier. No, you made one specifically for this company. And make one today. It is very inspiring, also confronting work. For example, you might find out you've been working here for 22 years or whatever. And I can help. I mean, I read a lot of these things. You can just send me your CV and I'll send it back and I will give you comments and I'll help you improve it. And there are a lot of things. If you even work on this a little bit, then you are already better than most candidates. So, recruiters and contractors, I'm going to skip this one because we're out of time. Employability. We're going to race through this. I said you're going to be happy for 40 years. And this is the part where it will really, really be depressing. You want to have a job until you retire, if such a thing even exists anymore. And there are lots of ways to mess it up. For example, you could become very good in a very niche subject and then find out that no one is hiring 55-year-old IT admins, which is extremely sad, but it is the case. You could become a big expert in BGP and then suddenly find out that almost no one is doing that anymore. Let's say that happens. You could be a super duper expert in a brand like Cisco, and then suddenly the brand fades, and well, shit, you are a super duper expert in IBM mainframes. Um, However, there is some sort of advantage to being sort of wedded or married to a brand because you can actually go work at the brand, which some of you have done, and that's a nice way to sort of broaden your experience. This is a terrible example. You can work for 20 years for a big employer and find out you are an expert at working at your employer. And your employer really enjoys you being an expert in that employer, and no one else enjoys that. And I have seen this extremely painfully over at the companies like Shell, where people were very valued and respected within Shell. And then they got fired and they found out that on their resume, they could really say, yeah, I'm an expert in Shell. And it turns out that people outside of Shell are not super interested in that. So changing jobs every once in a while is just good because you might confuse the fact that your employer values your expertise at working at that employer and not realize that no one else wants that. So, employability. That is, could someone hire you? This is about as much fun as discussing death. The Netherlands is terrible. Terrible. You have to be super young here to get a job. And no one hires technical hands on people over 50. It just doesn't happen. Unless you have extremely strong references. If you show up as some random old dude and you're like old in the Netherlands in the workforce, if you're 50, you might as well be dead. So you cannot sit there and be happy with your current job and think, I'm going to write this out. Because eventually your current employer will die, or they fire you, or become too toxic to tolerate, and often all three. So don't get stuck in this legacy software and technology unless you are sure you can write it out for the next 10 years until you retire. And you can be super nice with Perl, and you can probably write that out for a few more years, or COBOL even works. But don't become an old person and use yesterday's technology when you're 35, because you have another 35 years to work. Um, Now I come to the weird part. It is very difficult to be an old technical person in the Netherlands. It's very easy to be an old manager in the Netherlands. Um, some of you might really want to consider going to the dark side and saying, well, actually, I don't have to be the next BGP expert, but I would like to be the manager of the BGP experts. And the nice thing is, being a manager, you can sort of be a manager for 30 years and not learn anything, and you will still be a good manager, which never works in technology. Many of us have worked for very well-paying American companies, and you could tell yourself, "Yeah, I'm never going to do this. I'm never going to work for this expensive Silicon Valley place because it sucks." But maybe sometimes you have to. Maybe sometimes you're going to say, "Okay, hey, I'm going to make a lot of money because that fits where I am right now in my lifestyle. I need the money to pay for this house because I need to raise a family." So do really give it a thought. You don't necessarily need to get stuck in your current style of employers. And the last one is really also inspired by people over at NLNOG. You can seriously ponder leaving the field of IT. You can really say, look, I'm sick and tired of this, and I'm going to deliver mail, I'm going to drive trains, I'm going to work at a hospital, I'm going to teach. Really keep this open as an option if you don't see yourself competing against automation, people outsourcing everything to the cloud, or people outsourcing everything to countries far away. It is honestly an option. So I have already really run out of time, so I will summarize it now. It is vital to work on having an actual good job most of the time. Having a bad job will eventually kill your mental health, and it will likely also kill your actual health, and your family and friends will suffer. In the short term, and you can start doing that today, you can optimize your salary and see if you can reduce work related pain, for example, by working less. In the medium term, write a really good CV and scout the job market. Spend time on that. That is good to do anyhow because it might also make you appreciate your current job. Don't be too comfortable in your current job, even if you've told yourself that is perfect. It will never remain perfect for the next 20 years. And longer term, work on staying employable by maybe becoming a manager or maybe just work somewhere else. And with that, I'm rounding it off. You can find the slides on tinyurl.com/next40. And there you can also find the previous presentation, Escaping the Data Center. And with that, I'm rounding it off. Thank you.
Thank you for your great presentation, Bert. And what I liked about it is that there is something in there for everybody, for employees, but also for the good employers. Because if you are a good employer, then I think you will have paid very good attention to this presentation and drew maybe one or two lessons from it. We have a fair number of interesting questions that came up during your presentation, and I will pick a couple that I think you may have nice feedback on. Somebody says, I might be worried to threaten to leave my current job. I might be worried that this may burn bridges or cause people to get angry with me later on. Do you think this is a real threat, or is that just paranoia?
No, well, let me put it this way. The first rule is you may love the company, but the company never loves you. So if you worry that the company might maybe treat you badly, they could do that anyhow. You need to make sure that there is a balance. You need that the employer knows there is a risk that this guy or girl could be going away. And they deal with this all the time. So let me tell you that if you work at an HR department, you get at a decent sized company, you get 5 people a week doing this, and it's completely normal. And so they will not be amazed. Maybe your own personal boss or manager will say, hey, this is not fair and this is not loyal and whatever. But HR departments just deal with this all day long. So I would not worry about this.
Thank you. Another one that we had is if there is a guideline on what to look for if you write your CV. Some people like to write the CV more like a book, and others say it always has to fit on one page. Do you have a simple recommendation on that one?
Well, one thing so there are some generic remarks. Some of these contracting agencies, they send you like these 12-page CVs to make sure that everything that someone has ever done is listed on the CV. If you are applying for a job at a normal company, then that is not very helpful. Because that very long list just says, look, this guy is only good at the following things. The most important part when writing a CV and a letter, and I cannot stress this enough, is read the job vacancy. Read the company website. And if the vacancy says, look, we really enjoy automation and continuous integration, then make sure that your CV has those two things in bold. So if the vacancy says we like continuous integration and automation, your CV has to say I like continuous integration and automation. And that is the most important part because it tells the employer two things. You actually read my vacancy and you care about my company, and you probably actually like the automation and the continuous integration. And I would say that is the very most important part that people mess up, because you often get these CVs that you wonder, do you even know where you are applying? Are you even applying for this job?
I think that is very valuable advice. Thank you, Bert. There is one more question that came up, and it is if you could hint to us where you are in your own graph.
Yeah, that's a very good one. And I knew this one was coming, so I prepared that a little bit. So I make a shitload of money, and I'm also most of the time pretty happy. And that's maybe an extra reason why it's worth listening to me, because I have lived this, and I have lived in many places of this graph, but sort of currently I'm sort of at maybe 0.5 and somewhere north of 100,000 euros, and I can recommend that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bert. That was a great talk, and I think you had great questions that we've been able to answer really well. So thank you very much again for this talk, and hope to see you next time.
Okay, thank you.
Then for us, it's time to go to somebody who always has things. I mean, everybody knows, every network engineer has a list of things that they always need to find out at some point. And one guy that I know who always comes up with the ideas or the things that I think I need to find out at some point when I have time is Arjen Vijn. And when we approached him for this NLNOG day and asked him if we had a possibility that he would give a presentation, he said, "Sure, I have this subject and that subject and that subject. What do you want me to talk about?" So it was actually a pretty hard choice. In the end, we chose to ask Arjen to present about a new Star Wars character, and the Star Wars character is called TR-069. That's on my list of things to find out one day. So if I pay attention to this presentation, then I think Arjen is going to show us the way.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I didn't make up the title. I had to find the Star Trek character, Star Wars Star character TR-069, and I have it here on my presentation. Where is my presentation? Here it is. The TR-069. Disney tried to stop me from showing it, but it has green lights, very scary green lights, long 4 legs, and it hoovers. And that's all I can tell about it, about this character. So I go on with my connecting to the previous speaker. I'm going to tell you about myself and my career development. And my career development started out with these things. These are gravure rotary printing presses, and these things are huge. You see, you need ladders and stairs to get up and down. This thing is about 480 cubic meters. And then my career took a turn into networking, and I had to deal with these kind of devices. Also loud, but a little less big. Still couldn't carry it myself. And my career took a turn, and now I'm working with these pieces of plastic. So if you put that in a graph, you see my career development went down into the right. But less is more. The printing presses, those were 2 big machines. The networks I'm referring to, less than 100 elements, and these small home routers, we're talking about thousands or tens of thousands. And that's what actually my presentation is about, managing and supporting lots and lots of CPEs. Let's go back in history. Before roughly 1998, actually, I don't know exactly when, we used dial-in modems, which were typically purchased and managed by the subscribers of an ISP themselves, who can't remember the Hayes AT command set. Then ADSL came, and later cable modems came, and those were provided by the ISPs. And with that, the ISPs also got support requests for these customer premise equipment. And how did they do that? Well, they had to send engineers on site. There was probably some remote management using Telnet, SSH, SNMP. But if you have to manage like hundreds of thousands of devices using Telnet, and you have multiple devices with vendor-specific interfaces, you have help desk people handling the calls and the support request. Well, you got pretty much into custom scripting, CLA scraping, those kind of solutions. So around 2004, the Broadband Forum, which is a club of ISPs and equipment manufacturers, figured out a better way to manage CPEs. Technical report, or the CPE1 management protocol, CWMP. And what were the goals? And I copied and pasted this from the document. Auto configuration and dynamic service provisioning. Software, firmware image management, software module management, status and performance monitoring and diagnostics. To do that all remotely. And to do so, they did that. They figured out an architecture where all the CPEs were configured from the ACS, the Auto Configuration Server. Basically, it's an element manager for CPEs. And it uses the CPE1 management protocol to communicate over whatever network, it's network agnostic, between each other. How does the CPE know what the ACS is? Well, it usually is built in the profile that the ISP puts into modem and sends it out to the customer. But it can also be done by DHCP or even DHCP v6. And how does the data look like? Well, if you know SNMP, you will be familiar with it. It has a root, Internet Gateway Device, for example. And then you can branch in Internet Gateway Device, device info, Internet Gateway Device info, additional software version. And if you ask that from the CPE, it comes back with something like this. Or if you go Internet Gateway Device, device info description, it comes back with a string like that. This is very much similar to SNMP. Only in SNMP we have ASN1, we have used numbers, and later a database to tell you what these numbers mean. And TR069 uses text. Now, it can do a lot of things. For example, you can look into the Wi-Fi configuration, like is the radio enabled? That can be a Boolean. And that can be set by the ACS as well. So support people can enable or disable people's Wi-Fi. You can set the SSID. Many of the devices get multiple radios in it, for example, for 2.4 GHz and for 5 GHz. Hence, there are instance numbers sometimes in between the strings to make a distinction to those between those instances. It can look at the one side, for example, what are the DNSs? Can the user override the DNS for example, Google's DNS, or can it use this trustworthy DNS from a nice internet provider? What does the ACS needs to do? Well, it has to have a user interface, obviously. And if you look at the market of ACS software, the user interface is mostly a web interface. Some of them uses very corporate Java or even Windows. And many have help desk and call center modules that only show red and green lights. So red is bad, green is good. You don't want to communicate all the time with the CPEs. You want to store the version number, the software version, and only ask it like once a day from the CPE. So it needs to have a database to hold down the data. And also defined in TR069 is the northbound interface. That's the API, if you will, that talks to the business support system and the operational support systems that an ISP has. Looking at the protocol stack, this is sort of the same picture, but then looking at the protocols. On the left, the CPE, on the right, the ACS. And I'll go from bottom to top because I have somewhat background in networking and I like to do it from the physical layer on. The IP TCP, that should be clear here. Then TR069 uses HTTP optional encrypted. On top of HTTP, it uses SOAP XML. It was 2004, XML was very popular, hence SOAP XML. And that is a lot of things are defined in this SOAP XML schemas, even the errors, very structurally defined. And also the methods to call from the CPE to call from the ACS, the remote procedure calls are defined. And the TR069 standard also sort of tells what the functionality of the ACS and the CPE needs to be. So it's a whole protocol stack is being described in the standard. how does a typical TR069 or CWPM session looks like? It's important to understand that the CPE is the element that initiates the session, and it follows a push model. And it starts by sending an event, like a periodic event, like every 5 minutes or every 4 hours, the CPE is configured to contact the ACS to give it information, or actually to say, like, you can ask information from me. But it also is on the first boot, on a reboot, when a value changed, whatever event, it tells the ACS, hey, I have something to tell you. ACS responds with an informed response, like, well, I got what you wanted to tell me. And when the CPE is done, it sends an empty HTTP post to the ACS saying, like, I'm done, and now it's your turn. And then the ACS can request parameters. It can also set some parameters in the CPE. And the data is being exchanged this way. In the end, the ACS informs the CPE that it is done, and by sending an empty HTTP post. And then the CPE closes the session. It could be that the ACS wants to talk to the CPE. And in that case, the ACS can stimulate the CPE to start the session. It does so by sending an HTTP GET to an URL that is defined by the CPE. And this may, it is also optional, have a username and password. After it sent a request, hey, please contact me, the whole session is the same as I just described before. Then what are the events that the CPE can send to the ACS? Well, this is the whole list of standardized events. As you can see, there is an event for when the CPE contacts the ACS for the first time. There is an event for when the CPE is booted, the periodic interval. This is the most common event. There can be a one-time event scheduled by this ACS. There can be something as like a value change. The connection request I just talked about, and hence there are many events that are possible. Well, many, 13. They're also called so-called M events. Those are sort of labels that are attached to the events to tell, like, hey, I just got a boot. I was just rebooted, but the reboot was actually triggered by you, ACS. That is a possibility to do that. And these are the standard M events. And it is possible that vendors also can make their own events. Well, the event handling is pretty standard. It listens to the informer RPC, it sends a response, it waits for an empty HTTP post, and it's done. But what to do with that event now? Well, that depends very much on the use case. What to do with an event? It also depends on the brand and type of the CPE, of its functionality. Does it have Wi-Fi? Does it have a voice over IP? And here, the ACS vendors really like to sell consultancy and support contracts. And it is actually not easy. Right. Here, so ACS software usually handles this use for some kind of script language. To handle all the different use cases, you basically need you need kind of a programming language, a script language to handle that. Some have a vendor-specific language. Some have like a very nifty user interface, graphical. Some actually use scripting languages like Node, JavaScript, or Python to handle the events and then get the parameters and set the parameters depending on if then else cases and what have you. TR069 delivers some kind of data model in XML, but it is very basic. The Internet Gateway device that I showed before is standardized in a different document, actually, the TR98, Internet Gateway devices. This describes a whole long list of data points that could be or have to be or should be in an Internet Gateway device. And then you have 104 for if your gateway device has voice gateway in it. And then that TR069 was pretty good, and then people wanted to do triple play, and they had to put set-top boxes on people's televisions. They made TR135 to manage the set-top boxes, and that made that also TR069 had to do NAT. So TR069 got extended by net transversal using STUN or using XMPP. And then you wanted to do throughput analysis and statistics, which is then divided in TR143. So these are all like XML schemes, data models that are put on top of the TR69 protocol, or being incorporated in that. And then they needed to do Wi-Fi premises and performance testing because, yeah, the internet is down, but it is really the Wi-Fi of people in the homes. So Wi-Fi performance testing became in TR398, and you can see they also got fancier document covers with some consultant with a tie. And in the end, TR69 got a bit overloaded. Internet of Things came, more and more smart devices in people's homes might require some support. So TR069 is actually outdated. TR369 is the new star. It allows IoT devices and self-service customer portals. It enables provider partnerships by allowing third-party sort of third-party ACSs, if you will. It has to be downwards compatible with TR069. So it has a compatible data model, but yeah, it allows now for multiple controllers. ACS is just one of the controllers. It allows multiple transport protocols like CoWAP and STMP and MQTT, because TR069 is really bound to HTTP, the anti-HTTP post, for example. It uses, instead of XML, because this was 2019, it uses protocol buffers instead of XML and binary encoded messages. The agents, the devices to manage, they get really a command set where you can add things, get and set and delete things. And the whole message structure allows now for relative parts. If you look at the traffic of CWMP, then you see these long strings that repeat themselves over and over and over again because the root of the tree is the same and there is a whole lot of parameters on the end that change. Now you can say like, oh, I have this root path and I want to have this and these parameters down from that root path. It allows the use of keys instead of instance numbers, so you don't have to walk a tree from 1 to 50 to find find the data that you want. And it even allows search expressions. Well, I think I got really in time. These are the credits, and thank you. And I'm really open for questions. Oh yeah, and thanks. I'm self-employed, but I work for Freedom Internet, and I got from them the opportunity to actually choose and set up an ACS.
Yeah, that was actually going to be the first question. Thank you, Arjen, because you are involved with Freedom Internet, as you mentioned, and they have lots of consumer lines deployed in the field currently already. What role does TR069 play in supporting customers? I mean, after the connection has been delivered and should be up and running, do you have some kind of interface to help your support team at Freedom to look into the CPEs?
Yes, very rudimentary still, but yes.
Okay, that's great to hear. Another question is if you think that the TR069 support in the CPEs, do the vendors treat this securely by default, or is your feeling that security has been hacked on as an afterthought?
I don't know, to be honest. Wait a minute, I have to switch off the remote desktop session. It doesn't switch off.
Because in the
for the next speaker.
don't worry about the session, but I see that in the protocol there is an SSL and TLS being used, but is that like the only security, or is there more under the hood that you can think of?
Well, the CPEs have an URL to contact, and that URL is random, and also can be user and password authenticated, optional. So if you look at from the CPE side to remotely get into the CPE, you first need to find that URL, and then it will contact the URL of the ACS. So in that sense, it's not so easy to get in there, I think. Whether or not you can do something if you send something to this URL, because the URL is secret, but you might be able to find it, and might be able to send crafted data to it to get into the modem. I know that there have been people looking at that, and I know that security companies are hired by ISPs or hired by modem vendors, some modem vendors, to check that. But you're talking about huge numbers. So many ISPs try to find the cheapest modems in China. Because if you have 500,000 customers, like €1 is €500,000 difference. So if you can get it like €1 cheaper, you save €500,000. So whether or not that happens there, I don't know. What I can say from the ISP I'm involved with, Freedom Internet, AVM is a German vendor that takes this serious, and does actually look at that. If you look at from the ACS side, can you get into the ACS? ACSs are even the standard suggests to have the ACS open for the entire internet, because the idea is then, like, if your CPE cannot contact you through your own line, it can maybe find another way to get to the ACS, and then maybe the ISP can then configure your CPE. We limited to our own subnet that takes away at least a bit of the threat, and we put in the HTTP itself. We used another piece of software, a reverse proxy in front of it. That's been used a lot to at least have there a little bit more like installed base on the front. But also ACSs have been scrutinized by some security companies, and actually things have been found. Because ACS is a pretty high profile target. If you can take over the ACS, you can render all modems useless.
Don't give the DDoS kiddies a new idea here now, please. But with that,
Yeah.
I think it is time for us to thank you very much for your presentation, Arjen, and for being with us here today at NLNOG Live. So thank you again, and hope to see you next time.
Thanks.
At the last NLNOG Live event in July, we had a very great feedback on the out-of-band presentation because it was one subject that was covered by two different companies, and then there was a discussion afterwards. So for this NLNOG Live, we will have the same thing, and we won't be talking about out-of-band again, obviously, but we chose a different subject, and the subject is monitoring. There will be two people presenting about their monitoring schemes, and then there will be a short discussion afterwards with the two of them, and myself, I will be taking the questions again and bringing them to the presenters. The first presenter about their monitoring setup is going to be Mark Schouten, who works for Taxis. And I would say, Mark, take it away, please.
Hi, thanks. So my name is Mark Schouten. I'm CTO of Taxis. We do private cloud, small company based in Ede in the Netherlands. We take privacy very seriously, and so we think a lot of services that might improve privacy. And talking about monitoring. So I'm going to go quickly through monitoring. Which decisions did we make? What do you want to monitor? Why? How do you want to monitor? And we'll see where we end up. So ultimately, this is the goal. Obviously, this is not us. This is a customer. We want customers to be confident that we manage their infrastructure so that it remains up and running at all times. We also want, obviously, there are incidents every now and then. We want to minimize the impact of an incident, which you can arrange by building a clustered setup. But also monitoring plays a big role because it makes sure that you prevent an incident from growing bigger than you want. So there are many tools to do monitoring. We've looked at some of these. We currently use Sensu and LibreNMS. LibreNMS is a trend monitoring for us to keep in mind where things are going. We do not use it for notifications or anything. And then you have all these other tools which you can select on how you want to use them. Do you want the clients to push their results to the server, or do you want the server to pull results from the client? Both have their upsides. If you want the server to pull from the client, then you're always sure that the client is actually responding. Because if it doesn't respond, your check fails and thus you know it's down. If you push from the client to the server, that might take some more time because you don't want to alert directly if a client misses its a entry point. There might be some incident on the way. So you can choose between those. Then you also have open source and closed source, and obviously free versus paid. And believe it or not, even privacy is important here. We tested net data to see if we could do some more monitoring on the server itself, including graphs and stuff. And we found out that it actually loads stuff from Google, which we don't like, so we skipped that one. So ultimately, we ended up in the late 2018 with Sensu because it does what we wanted to do. We can configure our clients from the server. The client can authenticate against the server and request or knows which subscriptions it needs to get and which checks to run. The client on Sensu then pushes its results to the server, and it has a lot of events on which you can decide what to do. So you decided a tool to use for monitoring. Now it's time to choose what you want to monitor. So what we always monitor is CPU, because you want to know if a CPU is overloaded. For us, it's not really important if a CPU ever touches 100% incidentally. That's not a really big issue, I think. But if multiple checks report that the CPU is very busy, you might want to look into an upgrade or check out who is using so much CPU. We also monitor CPU steal, which is in virtualization when the VM wants to use CPU, but the host isn't able to deliver that CPU. I don't think you can monitor this in Windows yet, but at least on Linux, it's a very important value, especially if you buy VM capacity somewhere. It might be interesting to know if your supplier is actually able to deliver the CPU capacity that they say they are delivering. We also monitor swap, not memory, but swap. If swap is going to be used a lot, you know that you have to do something about your memory management. Then we also monitor cron because it is an important tool for some cleanup scripts to run, and that if cron doesn't run and the cleanup scripts don't run, it will ultimately cause other issues. Uptime is a very important thing to monitor, because we've had servers before we monitored uptime, obviously, that rebooted so fast that we didn't even notice any downtime in the services, because it rebooted so fast that monitoring was in time with delivering new checks. So it's very confronting when you log into a machine and suddenly it reboots. In this case, it was a broken PSU. And then we also monitor disk space to prevent other services from failing, which is the goal ultimately to prevent. What don't you want to monitor? We don't want to monitor memory usage. Very often it's not uncommon to have a server using a lot of memory. Also, it's not per se a problem. Sometimes there's a service that just tries to use all the memory that is available. That's not an issue. If you add more memory to the service would just start using more memory. So we don't think memory is an important thing to monitor. Also, we don't monitor every single service we can find on a server. The image you see is what you get when you search for notification hell. That is what happens if you start monitoring everything, and it will, in case of an event, cause a lot of notifications, and not all of them might be useful, which is confusing and takes time while you try to investigate the actual issue. So when you decide what to monitor, keep in mind that you are trying to prevent the service from going down. So if you have a cluster of multiple servers, it's not really an issue if one of the server goes down. It is a issue if the service goes down. So differentiate between those things, because you might sleep better because you're not woken up for a single service that goes down, or server that goes down while the service is actually functioning pretty well. Where's my slide? Yeah. So things to keep in mind when configuring the scripts. This took a while for me to find out, but I find out it's pretty important to run your check at an uneven second rate. If you start with running your check every 300 seconds and you have a cron script that runs every 5 minutes, you might be notified for CPU, because the script that you run every 5 minutes is taking a lot of CPU, and you are just checking the CPU at every instance of that cron script. So try to run it at an uneven number of seconds, so you scan through the whole day. Our scripts always stick to the Nagios plugin return codes, which make it easy to take scripts from other places. That's a pretty simple standard. What we do is we don't alert engineers immediately after a single critical error. We wait for 3 non-OK results, and then we start complaining to make sure that someone investigates. After those 3 non-OK results, we will start sending pushover messages mostly. We have also had a function that a person is going to get a phone call, but also SMS, text messages, and email. And we try to keep that coming until someone actually acknowledged that the message was received, and the person that acknowledges is expected to follow up on the message. 2 years ago, we also decided to stop waking up persons, mostly me, through warning messages. At night, there's a lot of scripts that run that might cause some warnings on load on the server. They're not always useful to alert on. We do that between midnight and 7 in the morning, so you can get a fair amount of sleep. And so far we haven't had, it's always a risk, obviously, because a warning might lead up to a critical somewhere. But so far, the results for this decision were pretty good. Like I said, we chose Sensu for monitoring. Unfortunately, Sensu decided to become enterprise. They now introduced a new setup, and that's not really how we like to see it. So we've started building something ourselves. It's called Ature. It's far from finished, but there's a proof of concept on GitHub somewhere. The meaning is that it would be HTTPS and JSON communication only, both ways. We could use the Nagios checks. It's based on Python, so it can basically run anywhere. We've tried Linux, FreeBSD, and Windows so far. And if you have any interest in using it, feel free to help and collaborate with us on building it. And this is it for me. I think we're going to switch to Ian. Thanks for listening.
Good afternoon. I'm Ian, DevOps engineer at LonUp. I'm here to talk about monitoring today, but let me just introduce LonUp and myself to give you some context of what we're monitoring and what my experience of it is. We're an IXP, a neutral, not-for-profit internet exchange point. We're the second largest in London, and we're founded in 1997. We've got around 220 members, around 350 connected ports. We peak at just over 0.5 terabit per second of traffic and 80 million packets per second. There are 4 full-time staff, 3 of us who are engineers. We all work remotely from different parts of the country. So we're a small company, but we run a fair-sized network, and we provide a stable, very viable and cheaper alternative to links. Being a different company with completely separate infrastructure, operating out of the same city and many of the same facilities, gives networks good opportunity for choice and resilience. My main responsibilities are servers, automation, monitoring and development. But as is typical in a smaller company, I do get involved in things like the network and the DC work too. Prior to LonApp, I was the platform manager for a hosting company. I'm responsible for their cloud virtual machine platform and amongst other things. And there was a lot of complexity, a lot of moving parts. The company had over 30 staff, more defined departments, quite busy on-call roles. So that really gave me some good insights into monitoring and some of the problems associated with it. So we have 3 types of monitoring in place. We have alerting, metrics, and a weather map. Our alerting system is constantly checking all aspects of our infrastructure and services. It tells us if there's a problem, or hopefully that there isn't any problems, ideally where the problem is. It interrupts what we're doing and draws our attention to issues. Metrics I'd describe as a wealth of historical data about our infrastructure and its performance. This can be used for reporting, debugging, to see trends, dips, spikes, for capacity planning, and because of its graphical nature, can be used for spotting problems that haven't triggered service alerts. It can alert us to problems elsewhere and provides a good overview of service quality. The weather map provides a really useful high-level view of our peering LAN at a glance, in particularly inter-site links, or ISLs as we call them, connecting each of the devices and how much traffic we're doing between each site or device, which is one of the biggest things we need to keep an eye on and plan for. The rest of this talk will focus on the alerting side. I'm currently working on refreshing that, replacing it. It's very much work in progress. I've not solved all of the problems I'll mention today, and there's still many more things we can add checks for. It's only a few switches, right? We have 10 racks containing 21 production switches for the peering LAN. Then there are lots of ISLs, the links between them. Each rack has an out-of-band management switch linked together to form a separate management LAN. Each rack also has a terminal server, most with out-of-band connections provided by another network, an access point, a pair of PDUs. A number of racks have WDM systems. We run 7 servers as VM hosts distributed around the sites. We currently have around 80 VMs on those hosts. Those host things like our website, customer portal and database, mail server, ticket system, voice over IP, wiki for documentation, GitLab for code repositories and CI, VPNs, Jumpbox, rack and inventory management, backups, a whole host of monitoring and metrics related hosts, and even a ring.NLNOG node. Against each device or machine, we want to run a bunch of checks, most of them at a relatively low interval, so we can find out quickly if something's gone wrong. We're currently monitoring around 150 entities and generating around 1,500 monitoring events every 30 to 60 seconds. And there's still lots more to add. Like I said, it's a work in progress. We'll probably end up doubling that number of events in the coming months. It's not exactly huge scale, but it illustrates how these things grow and get bigger and turn into something non-trivial when you think you're just monitoring a few switches. So what do we have before? We had a good old Nagios install. That worked well for many years, since well before my time at LonApp. It did the job, but it had grown stale. There was a whole bunch of things that were showing us down all the time. It had got out of date, checks were broken and needed looking at. Then there was lots of flapping. It would chirp away all night and all day into a Slack channel. This made it easy to ignore it a lot of the time, as the channel was always full of alerts. It was a classic case of alert fatigue. Nagios also, in general, is quite dated. It was great back in the day. I'm sure lots of people still use it and find it useful. And there are several forks of it, which improve different aspects. But it's very much geared around static configuration files. Those config files can, of course, be generated from inventory systems or other data, but it very much relies and works around that static config. Before I tell you about what we've replaced it with, I'm just going to get into some lessons I've learned or opinions I have on monitoring, with some general experience. The first one, monitor everything. It sounds like an obvious point, but as you saw in the previous talk, Mark had a different opinion on that. But my aim is to monitor as much as possible, to have checks for everything I can think of. Anything you would check up on to see if something isn't working correctly, or is working correctly, hopefully. You want your monitoring system to not only inform you of problems, but to be a single place to look to establish that either everything is definitely functioning correctly, or there's a problem and where that problem is. But alerting is hard. In fact, for me, it's the hardest part of monitoring. You need to be informed of problems so you can respond accordingly, but alert fatigue is a big problem. If you're getting alerts all of the time, then you're quickly going to start ignoring them, or you're going to be spending all of your time fixing problems and not having time to do other parts of your job. Or like Mark says, you're going to get woken up in the night a lot. So there's a couple of things to think about here. Firstly, direct the alerts to the right people, i.e. alerts need to be relevant to the recipient and they need to be able to deal with them. So they either need the knowledge of systems or access to systems. Alerts need correctly prioritizing and classifying. There are some alerts that are really urgent, some alerts that are semi-urgent, some things which are just warnings and you need to know about them, but they're not particularly urgent. Let me give you some examples from our use case. If one of our production peering switches are down, then we need to know right now. Every minute matters. I want my phone ringing, someone banging on the door, alarms going off, wake me up in the night. We need to drop everything and we need to deal with it now. If our website, portal, phone system, email, or one or two root servers is down, then that's relatively urgent, especially as those are public-facing systems. We want to stop and fix them as soon as possible, but it's not affecting our core service, which is that peering LAN. If one of our ISLs goes down or one of multiple name servers stops responding, then we want to know so we can investigate and fix it, but it's not an outage, it's not service affecting. The network is designed to be redundant and for that not to be a problem. So we don't need to be interrupted if we're in the middle of something. We just need to know about it so we can sort it out or investigate. If a disk is getting a bit full or an SSL certificate is due to expire in the next 14 days, then again, we need to know, but it's something we can look at as and when, not something that we need to be disturbed about anyway. So we need to be clever and precise about how we alert, when we alert, and who alerts are sent to. Otherwise, we experience, the problems Mark was talking about. I prefer to take the approach of monitor everything, have all of the data available, but kind of then choose where and how we alert. We have all the alerts going into a few categorized Slack channels, but then for urgent infrastructure alerts, we use the Telegram messaging app as it provides a handy API to send messages, the flag up on our phones, and it's cross-platform, so it doesn't matter what devices people have. I like to receive a copy of alerts via email as they can contain more detail and not just a one-line summary that we might put in Slack. And I also have some going to push over, which alerts my phone. Sorry, last point on that. Alert earlier rather than later. So with things like disk space, we want to try and alert early and give notice so it can be dealt with before it's a critical problem. If we alert at, say, 95% and it raises at midnight, by the next morning that could be 99 or 100%, and then we've got a major problem. If we alert at 80%, then that alert can sit around for a while, possibly even days, if we're busy or unavailable, and we can still deal with it before it's even an issue. Alert floods. Systems are often not standalone. For example, if we're running VMs or containers, then those systems are reliant on the underlying VM host. If we are running a network, then a whole bunch of systems or devices could be behind a single device or link. Even if it's just a single host or device that fails, we might be monitoring a whole load of different ports or services on that device. If we just set up checks to monitor those things and alert on them, then a single failure of a host, switch, or link could cause a whole long list of alerts. What we really want to do is build knowledge of these dependencies into our monitoring, so it ideally raises a single alert pointing to the actual underlying failure or problem, not each and every symptom of it. We can go look at that information once we've picked up the alert to see what the effects are and how far-reaching the problem is. But ideally, we just get a single alert saying there's a problem, go look. It's still very much a to-do item for me, and we've got a lot of work to do in that respect. Occurrences equals 2. If you set up a bunch of checks and alert when they first fail, then particularly with ping checks, load, CPU usage, etc., you're quickly going to end up with a whole host of down and up alerts as things spike, fluctuate, or are busy. In my experience, only alerting on the second consecutive occurrence of a problem is an almost magic fix to this. If you performing a check every, say, 30 seconds or a minute, then for it to happen twice in a row over a minute or two is a real problem. If it fails once and then it passes again, it's more of a monitoring anomaly or a quick spike that you're not particularly concerned about. Obviously, you could take this further and start an alert only on a high number of occurrences, juggling the frequency of the check and how quickly you need to know about a problem. But general, I find occurrences equals 2 to work surprisingly well. On a related note, in some circumstances, you may want to take into account events that happen faster than that interval times number of occurrences. I do that with BGP sessions. If a session flaps, I still want to know about it. So I monitor the session uptime as well as the actual up-down status. And quite often we'll get an alert to say, a session's only been up a few seconds, but we didn't actually see it go down because it happened in that interval. Similarly, with an uptime on Linux boxes, I want an alert if it was rebooted, even if it came back quick enough that service alerts weren't triggered. Flapping is when a check repeatedly alerts and clears, either because something is going up and down or something is on the verge and just keeps going over and under the threshold. Obviously, we see this quite a lot with fiber. If we have fiber links, if a problem develops, we can kind of see it going up and down and up and down. What we don't want is a whole long list of alerts for the same thing. Some monitoring has flap detection. So it will alert a few times, detect it's flapping, and then not send you an alert again until things settle down. Monitoring load, the purpose of monitoring is to reveal problems, but care needs to be taken that it doesn't cause problems. Monitoring checks can add extra load to devices, particularly those checks against a device with a slow control plane. For example, we need to probe our collector, which is a Cisco router, to obtain the state of several hundred sessions as often as possible. I had to ensure that there was a sleep between each check to ensure the load on both the router and the machine executing the checks, which is doing many other checks at the same time, was acceptable. Be proactive. A monitoring system needs regular upkeep, otherwise it gets stale. Alerts need to be investigated. Is it a genuine problem or is it a false alert? If a check's alerting regularly, then efforts should be taken to rectify that by tweaking the parameters of the check or alerting, or improving the system, adding resources, etc. If you kind of let things slide, then you end up with a backlog and it just becomes difficult to deal with. If you keep on top of it and keep improving, keep iterating, then you can end up with a good monitoring system. For me, a good monitoring system is one that's quiet all of the time, unless there's a genuine problem that needs our intervention, and that's what I strive to build. So looking at what we replaced the old Nagios install with, like Mark mentioned again, we use Sensu. It was originally a Ruby application. In recent years, it was rewritten in Go for better performance and easier distribution. An open source core is available for those willing to package it themselves. But the company behind Sensu provides commercial packages which add enterprise features. They're free for up to 100 entities. After that, the user either needs to switch to the open source version and lose the extra features, or start paying for a license to be able to add more entities. Sensu is a bit different from Nagios in that two things: it's distributed and it's API driven. Distributed with Nagios, checks are mainly executed on the box running Nagios. With Sensu, every machine in your infrastructure runs an agent, kind of similar to the NRPE daemon in Nagios, if people are familiar with that. The agent subscribes to certain subscriptions depending on the role of the host. The back end or cluster of backends doesn't actually perform any checks. It just schedules checks for agents to perform, communicates with them over a message bus, and handles the result coming back in the form of events. And it's API driven, so rather than defining everything in static configuration files, everything is defined using API calls, which makes it easily automatable and dynamic. Because of this dynamic nature, monitoring can be built into a configuration management system. So when a new host is provisioned, the Sensu agent is installed, configured as part of the deployment by SaltStack in our case. Once we've set up checks for a particular role, more hosts can be brought online, and when the Sensu agent connects, they'll automatically be monitored without touching any kind of monitoring configuration. So if I just bring a new web server online, then whatever checks are relevant to a web server are automatically going to happen, or a Linux host, of course. Then for hardware devices like switches, routers, terminal servers, PDUs, etc., which don't run the Sensu agent directly, I've written scripts to query Netbox, where we keep an inventory of those devices, and I generate data to create entities that feed into the Sensu API. So let me just talk you through some of the terminology, which will give you an idea how Sensu works. So we have entities. An entity is anything being monitored, and there are two types of them. Agent entities are hosts running the Sensu agent. An agent has a list of subscriptions which determines which checks are scheduled for it to execute. And a proxy entity. So Sensu allows monitoring of other things which can't run an agent, like a device or a virtual thing like a website, a URL. Checks can be executed on an agent but attributed to a proxy entity instead of the entity actually running the check, making it appear as if the proxy entity was executing the check. And then for each check, there's a certain flow that happens. So checks are commands which are executed on an agent. The commands are compatible with Nagios, i.e. the return 0 for OK, 1 for warning, 2 for critical, etc. Checks have an interval, a list of subscriptions, and a list of handlers. The check will be executed on the agents which have a matching subscription and passed to each handler, which will process the check result. Checks can also return metrics, so they can cut out the need for running separate processes like collect or telegraph. Hooks are commands which will be executed on a particular check result. They can be used for further diagnostics or to even attempt resolution. So, for example, if a disk space check returns warning or critical, a hook could be added to run df-h to provide more context to an alert. Or if a process check returned critical because, say, engine X wasn't running, a hook could attempt to restart it automatically. Effectively try and clear its own alerts. Events, when a check's executed, an event is created with the results. These events are handled by one or more handlers as defined by the check. Filters are defined by a handler to filter which events are actually dealt with. For instance, we don't want to receive an alert every few minutes to say everything's okay. Like, we only want to receive alerts when there's a problem, and then we don't want it to alert on every subsequent check, only once or every so often if an alert doesn't clear. Mutators can change or add to the check data before certain handlers deal with it. So, for example, we might want to reformat the output of some metrics before we pass them to a certain time series database. And handlers deal with events. So, for example, send alerts or store metrics. When I was talking earlier about categorizing and prioritizing alerts, handlers combined with filters make this possible and really flexible, since we can have a whole host of handlers with different alerting mechanisms and criteria that we can then use to control what is alerted, how alerts are sent, and we can control that per entity or per check and override it. Another powerful feature is token substitution. A single check can be reused for many entities by substituting tokens in check commands with entity attributes or labels or annotations associated with the entity or the check. what I do is keep all of these definitions in a Git repository. I have a script to dump them out of Sensu using the API, so I can ensure that the repo stays in sync with what's in Sensu. That means I could take a fresh install of Sensu and in minutes have our full monitoring system up and running, like just by feeding back in those definitions. It also makes sure it's version controlled, and when I push changes to GitLab, then the rest of the team see them in Slack so they know something's changed. And then to finish, I'll just quickly give you a glance at some of, just a few definitions from Sensu. So with a check definition, you'll see I'm defining a check called check HTTPS. I'm using the standard Nagios plugins as packaged in Debian, so that makes it really easy. Check v46 is useful because it'll run the command twice, once for IPv4, once for IPv6. You can see I'm listing the handlers, which will send the alert. So you'll see it's going to Slack after 2 alerts. It's going to push over. It's going to my email. Those are the handlers I've defined for that check. And it's going to run every 60 seconds, and it will round robin between all hosts which are subscribed to the Sensu proxy role, which are some hosts that I have dedicated to running proxy checks. It'll run on all hosts with the HTTPS label defined, or all entities, should I say, and set to yes, which is populated by salt when a web server is deployed. Looking at a handler, the Slack twice handler sends an alert to Slack after the second occurrence of a failure, and you can see the filter there only after 2 events that makes that happen. So you'll see that we will only send a Slack notification if it's an incident, i.e. it's not an OK result. If that check or host isn't silenced and after 2 events. What I can also do is that you can't see in here is I can override, say that things like the Slack channel, I can override that per check and per entity, so I can control where things alert to. So, for example, for dev boxes, I have those alerts go to an alerts low channel that can largely be ignored, and not everyone is a member of. And taking a look at the filter, so you can see the expression there that means it only alerts on check occurrences equals 2. Which is what I mentioned earlier, or if it's a resolution alert and 2 occurrences of the problem occurred, so therefore an alert was sent. So I can control that with filters. So in summary, there's quite a lot of work and thought goes into a good monitoring system. In reality, I don't think it will ever be perfect, but it's just a constant loop of iteration and tweaks and improvements. Thank you.
And thank you too, Ian, for your presentation. Ian, it would be a good idea if you could fetch some earbuds somewhere, because otherwise you won't be able to hear the questions without them echoing back into your microphone. So maybe if you have earbuds, then please go and fetch them. Meanwhile, Mark, we have had a couple of interesting questions, and one of them is if you have any experience with using streaming telemetry, because I think that many network vendors in particular are trying to push us towards using streaming telemetry in our monitoring systems. But I have not seen any implementations of streaming telemetry yet, but it seems very promising. But do you guys know of anyone actually using it? First, maybe Mark?
Nope.
No. Ian?
No, I mean, it's very much something we've talked about. It's definitely on our to-do list to look into, but we kind of wanted to replace some of these old systems and get something basic in place before we went to the next level and started that. So it's definitely something we mentioned, but no, not currently.
Understood. I did also get a question about using scripts to auto-solve problems that occur. And you did touch on that, Ian, with the hooks that you mentioned. Can you guys discuss the ups and downs of having scripts that will automatically solve problems that occur in monitoring? Because I can imagine that it's not always a good idea to have a script automatically fix something that pops up in monitoring. I see you have ideas about that, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that it can do, and we might do in the future. We don't actually do it at the moment. And yeah, it can be a mixed bag. If it's something simple like, the example I use, like Nginx, is the processor's gone and it's not responding anymore, then we can try and restart it. But as things get more complicated, then you can end up, trying to run scripts to fix things. You can end up making more of a mess or losing your debugging data. Any engineer will know that, ideally to fix a problem, you need to be able to reproduce it. If something dives in and starts restarting stuff and trying to fix stuff, then, potentially you damage that debugging trail that's going to let you fix the actual problem. So it can be handy, if things fix themselves in the middle of the night without you doing anything, that's great. But you've also got to do it with a lot of caution and know that, what you're running is foolproof, really.
Yeah, and speaking about the debugging trail, when I look at monitoring in our own company, I always feel that there's two different kinds of monitoring. I think first you want to have monitoring that simply stores a lot of data so you can find back later what happened. And then there is also monitoring that is more real time and alerts you to what is happening now. Because I can imagine that you want to see a link, if it goes down, you want to see it immediately. But if it turns out that it is a faulty optic or something, you want to see that it has the optical values have decreased over the last year. Then you need a system that stores all this data. Mark, do you have experience in separating those two different types of monitoring systems, and how do you deal with that? How do you keep your history and your actual real-time alerting apart?
Well, we use LibreNMS for storing history of all services. So we have, I think every server that is being monitored by Sensu is also in LibreNMS. So we can foresee some issues, and indeed, I've just had a failing optic, and indeed you can see in LibreNMS that power is going down gradually. So there are people that are using LibreNMS also for notifying about issues. We don't use that because we have a separate system besides that.
Any thoughts on that, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the talk, when I said, we have three types of monitoring, there's the weather map we can look at, there's the alerting system, and then the metrics for us is very much what you describe. And I guess there's a fourth one that I should have had on that list, and that's syslog. So for history, all devices report to some central syslog servers, and we have all of the metrics. So, we store in graphite, all optical levels, anything like that. So we could, temperatures, that kind of thing. So we can very easily go back, years if we need to, and see a graph of, this link that's suddenly dropping out all the time. Has it declined over time? Has it just got worse? Has it always been like that? But it just hasn't quite hit the threshold of dropping out. Obviously has some fiber being squished somewhere. So yeah, we do that.
Sounds perfect. I have one final question for you guys before we go into the break, and that is, of course, the obvious one. How do you monitor your monitoring?
I forgot to mention it. So we have a separate machine in another data center in another network that is pulling data from the main monitoring server.
And you, Ian?
Yeah, very similar again. We actually have 4 Sensu instances. One is monitoring all of our devices. One is monitoring all the servers. And then we have 2 outside of our network on some of our members' networks. One that's in London and very close to us, and one that's a bit further out in another country. So we can monitor our externally facing things from outside our network and get alerts that way.
And of
And it
course,
also
you have
monitors.
the NLNOG ring as well, of course. That will also help tremendously.
Yeah.
Thank you guys very much, both of you, for presenting your monitoring setups. And I think people will have been able to take one or two things away from this. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again soon. And with that, I think it is time to go into our break. We have a break of 15 minutes planned, so we will be back just after 3. The slide will say 3, but just stick around and we'll give you 15 minutes for coffee and toilet breaks and everything. So we'll be back. There will be about a 15-minute break now. See you then. Hey everyone, welcome back after the break. Good to virtually see you again. Our next topic is going to be some real internet engineering, because what do you do once you get your shiny new router out of the box? Well, of course, you admire its blinking lights, you count if the number of ports is the same number that you ordered, and then you start protecting your control plane, because the only one who needs access to your router is going to be you yourself. And in this next block, we have found 3 vendors willing to tell us about how to implement control plane protection on their particular brand of routers. They will give a very short presentation. We try to cram it in 9 minutes, which is quite short, but we'll see how that works out. The first guy who will talk to us about protecting the control plane in their routers is going to be Greg Hankins from Nokia. Take it away, Greg.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me virtually. I'm really pleased to join you from my couch in Atlanta, Georgia, all the way across the pond. I'm going to give you a brief introduction about our control plane protection features. This is a topic that we normally talk about for at least an hour, so I'm trying to cram all this into 9 minutes. I should also mention that everything that I'm talking about today is specifically for our own ASICs, our FP ASICs. We also have a number of Broadcom platforms, and they have comparable protection features as well. We're basically trying to provide a number of layers that have mechanisms to protect the control plane. So we don't want to just have one place or one point where the protection occurs. And we're trying to isolate traffic as much as possible so that we can deal with it fairly and separate things so that they don't affect each other. And that's really 3 things, which is interface isolation, so traffic coming in from the internet into your router, and then we isolate that further into different protocols and even per peer isolation. A number of things that we do are filtering, classification, queuing, and then rate limiting on those queues. And our architecture is also a little bit unique in that our CPM, that's our name for the line card that has the CPU, it also uses the same packet processing ASICs that are used on the line card. So the same terabit processors that are on the line cards are also on the CPM, and those have a network processor that provides the line rate filtering, as well as a QoS manager that has access to thousands of queues, and that's what helps provide that fairness and isolation that I was talking about. All the functions are implemented in hardware, except for one thing, that's the out-of-band management Ethernet port filters, and I'll show you that on the next slide. This is an overview of all the different features, all those layers that I mentioned that provide that protection. Most of it, as I mentioned, is focused on in-band, so that's control plane traffic coming in from the line cards to the CPM. On the line cards, we have a number of things that are applied. We have filters, also called ACLs. This is where our distributed CPU protection runs. This is a set of rate limiting functions on the hardware, on the line card hardware, that provide that initial layer of filtering and protection. Then up to the CPM, we have an additional layer where we can add CPM filters specifically. This is also where that per peer and per protocol queuing mechanism kicks in. And we, of course, we have other things like TTL security, also known as GTSM, that's handled in hardware on the line cards too. The one thing that's not handled in forwarding hardware is that management Ethernet port. That's the one you see at the very bottom, and those filters are run just by the CPU. But this is a 100 meg interface in the inside of your network, and generally it should be fairly protected by your other security mechanisms. This is an overview of how the control plane traffic flows real quick. On the left side, you see traffic coming into the line card in different interfaces, and there's where we already do some distributed CPU protection. We isolate all the control protocols into different queues on a per interface basis. From there, they flow into the CPM filters. If you have the ACLs applied, those would work there. And then there are 2 different paths depending on the type of protocol. If it's a TCP-based protocol like BGP or LDP or something like that, SSH, then those sessions are automatically assigned a per peer queue. So each BGP session has its own queue in hardware, each SSH or LDP session as well. If it's not a TCP-based protocol like OSPF or ICMP or ISIS or something like that, then it gets thrown into a per protocol queue. So there's one protocol queue per protocol that goes into the line cards and protects the CPU from a particular protocol flood. Our distributed CPU protection, this is one of our advanced features. Let me tell you about it briefly. This is something that we highly recommend and is enabled by default. This provides that initial layer of granular rate limiting, so all the protocol traffic coming into the line card on an interface is automatically divided into those queues that I mentioned. They're rate limited and prioritized to the CPM. Is just an example of the different type of protocols, but you can see it's your common control plane protocols like BGP and ICMP, layer 2 protocols, things like that. And then from there, it goes into those per protocol queues. So these provide the isolation that I mentioned by separating different protocols into different hardware queues so that they can't overrun each other. So for example, if you have an ICMP flood to the router, then your LAC PDUs or your ISIS hellos and ISIS PDUs go into different queues so they're not affected by that ICMP flood to the CPM. And also, which is not mentioned in this presentation, it's a little bit outside of the scope here, is our software architecture has a multi-core CPU on the CPM as well as multi-process software architecture. And inside the scheduler, that also provides additional fairness. So even if there was a queue that was being flooded, the CPU actually wouldn't service that queue entirely. It would service all the queues coming in fairly as well. The last thing that I want to mention is an additional layer of protection, which is a control plays interface filter. This is, for example, a filter that you can configure for BGP. So in this example, we have wildcarding ability where we can just apply a filter on all BGP peers, on all groups, and then for peers that are in that neighbor or that group, it would just match and that goes to the CPU. And then any peer that's not configured, it would just be dropped on the line card and it doesn't even go to the CPU. Last couple slides are just a summary and recommendation, just a summary of things that I talked about and when to do it and if it's enabled. I'm not going to read through this. And then lastly, just a set of resources where you can read more information. And that's all I had. It was shorter than 9 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Well, Greg allowing me for some time. Thanks for that, Greg. I'm going to talk you through control plane protection in the US. And, well, you might hear some similarities here and there, but we are mainly based around 3 features that we have implemented in a mix of hardware and software. So first off, well, we've got a control plane ACL. So this is, well, pretty much any regular ACL you would normally have protecting your Linux kernel. Then we've got control plane policers, which are actually rate limiting all the traffic that is destined towards the CPU interface. And we've got a new feature, well, relatively new for us, which is CPU traffic policy. And CPU traffic policy actually protects using the data plane, so it actually filters traffic before it goes all the way through to the kernel. So to start off with the access control list, this access control list actually gets hit only at the very last of the forwarding pipeline. So first you would have traffic passing potential CPU traffic policy, moving on through the rate limiting, and then it would check whether it's allowed or not. Or you would go in again via the management interface, which gives you more or less a fast path to the kernel, which is sitting behind there. So what we see here is a pretty generic IP access list, which allows for a lot of management plane protocols, but also protocols that are used to manage the device itself. So think SSH or HTTPS if you're running your API calls over that. And these access control lists, well, they apply to all of the traffic hitting the kernel. In addition to this generic IP access list, we also have a dynamic IP access list in here, which is built up using the BGP neighbors that are configured in the device. And this same access list is also being used to enforce the GTSM. So note this is software based. So for the hardware based part, we're going to see about that after this. a lot of protocols, as said, that are being allowed by default. But even though they're allowed by default, if you actually look what's going over the line, so I ran a little nmap to see what actually was open and closed, and then you can see that even though there's quite some ports which are open in the access list, there's no service running, and thus the system has still kept them closed. If we take a look at policing, the policing itself is hardware based because there is this port on the forwarding ASIC, which is called in RIS to speak the CPU port. And here we apply this service policy. So the exact implementation is that it differs a little bit per device that you're running, whether it's like a Jericho class device or a Trident series device. But in the end, the traffic classification and policy map is being done using at least the same abstraction within EOS. So you're always going to see a global policy map, which is the COP system policy, and then there will be per protocol class maps, which very specifically map certain protocols into certain queues. These queues, of course, then get policed, so they will get a minimum reserved bandwidth per protocol, which will hopefully allow these protocols to keep running as expected. But then they also have a maximum allowed bandwidth, so shape rate, so they don't overrun the amount of bandwidth that they have been given and start blocking out other protocols. CPU traffic policy is a newer feature that is indeed like the hardware-based feature. So this is what we call a platform-dependent feature, so it will only run on certain platforms. It runs on EOS 4.22 and up, and it's supported by all of the devices we would grade as being capable to do full table internet routing. What CPU traffic policy does is it allows you a way to reject, police, or count traffic before it's actually being sent into the CPU port. So using this feature, you can allow traffic from trusted sources that's coming in through the data plane, so through your regular ports connected to, for example, your internet peers. While it's deducing automatic policies deferred on your BGP neighbor configuration, then does smart deduplication, so it doesn't flood your TCAM with too many rules, and it also allows for VRF awareness in your CPU traffic policy. If we take a look at how this is actually configured, we can see that there's a traffic policies part in the CLI where we can define a traffic policy and assign it to the CPU. And using this syntax, we can basically create match rules, give the match rules a name, and then a protocol, whether it's v4 or v6, and then we can select the protocol itself. So in this example, we've got ICMP v6 because that's one of the protocols that's required to have IPv6 working. We've got some BFD rules, so for the source and destination ports, both for v4 and v6. And then we actually have the BGP rule, and the BGP rule, we don't state protocol TCP source port and destination port 179, but we actually state protocol neighbors BGP. So what this will do is expand these rules in TCAM, and I'll explain a little bit more in the next slide. Then we match all the BGP traffic that doesn't match these neighbor rules, and we perform the action drop on it. So this is a hardware drop being performed in TCAM. We do the same thing for BGP6, and then the other routing protocols that we see. Now, note that for all of the protocols there, you don't really see anything behind the protocol itself. That's because the default action of a TCAM resource is to allow traffic. So therefore, we only see the catch-all rules on the end, so the default class for v4 and v6 to have a drop action. So if we zoom in a little bit on the per BGP peer policing, or well, peer actions, I should maybe say. What we apply here is basically we can say in the traffic policies, we assign the traffic policy to the particular to the CPU in all of the VRFs. We then state the traffic policy name, and we have the class there, and we say for all of the BGP neighbors that I've got, so this is all of the BGP v4 neighbors I've got actually, I want to do an action, and the action is police rate 15 kilobits per second. Now, the nice thing about this is that you're not just having this protocol global way of policing, which can still cause you to be under DOS attack, but you're actually going to install a per neighbor TCAM rule in TCAM. So that even if someone fakes traffic from one of your neighbors, they can't really DDoS the whole BGP control plane. And the last slide is resources. So there's a mix of resources centered around COP and well, some BGP security as well. Then we've got our general hardening guide, and as this is an NLNOG, well, also some Internet Edge configuration, which is in there, also including RPKI, which is now supported on all of our routing platforms. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, so good afternoon. My name is Melchior Almans. I work with Juniper Networks, and I'm sort of the last in row to summarize, I think, what control plane protection is. So let's start with very briefly how a router looks like. Basically, it consists of two planes, which is referred to as control plane and forwarding plane. And as you can see in the picture on the left side, forwarding plane consists of one or multiple line cards. So in this case, you would see a chassis having a single routing engine and two line cards. Obviously, in a fixed configuration, that could be either one line card or FPC, or in a chassis, it could be multiple, which are the most important components for this presentation. I won't go into all the details to not go over 9 minutes. So why do we need control plane protection? I think Niels already summarized it quite well. We want to only allow legitimate traffic to reach control plane. In other words, we want to filter, for example, DOS and DDoS traffic. We want to avoid TCP injections, TCP replay attacks, and of course we want to prevent BGP or BGP neighbors or OSPF adjacencies to form where we didn't expect them. And of course, we want to rate limit valid traffic. A very nice example of this is when a few years ago, I often saw this popping up when people were doing trace routes or MTRs in order to troubleshoot issues on the internet, that it appeared as if a Juniper box was the problem, as MTR or at least ICMP traffic would be dropped. That is by design, as that is typically something which the routing engine doesn't think it's that important, that it should always reply to ICMP. So it would prefer a BGP update, for example, over a ICMP ping. And on the left side, you see a very small sort of block diagram on how that works. So there's a difference between transit traffic, which enters a port and leaves a port on the router, and traffic that has a destination on the control plane. And in Juniper's terminology, we use the loopback address for that traffic. So what mechanisms are available? There is a embedded DDoS protection, which consists of two components: classification of host-bound control plane traffic and a hierarchical set of individual and aggregate policers. Basically, that is a fixed set of classifiers and policers we've built in. and they are applied at basically 3 different levels in the box. One is at the PFE, so the ASIC. The next level is at line card level, and obviously the third option is that loopback address we just mentioned. So in other words, the traffic that goes through to the routing engine. Obviously, there's the good old firewall filters, where we, as Greg was, I think, saying, have the easy button as well. So there is this sort of trick you can use, the apply path, we call it, that basically would allow all configured BGP neighbors to communicate with the routing engine. The apply path, here's the example for how that works in BGP, but obviously that works for other protocols as well. You could, for example, use it for configured NTP servers as well. Obviously, we only want to allow management traffic from our management network. So we build a filter that allows TCP port 22. And obviously, don't forget about the sort of well-known and widely used multicast addresses. In this case, an example is VRP. It's very easy to overlook that. There's of course an option to configure, to manually configure policers as well. And they would then, if they are more strict than the predefined policers, they would be used. Here you see an example of a policer that would limit a traffic stream to 1 Mbps. So you could apply this, for example, to SSH or NTP again or whatever. Another automatic rate limiting example is ARP traffic. The routing engine would limit that as well in order to prevent it to be overloaded with ARP updates, for example. But I think the most important thing is in control plane protection is obviously procedures and human factors. For almost every protocol, unsecure protocol like FTP or Telnet, there is in a lot of cases always a more secure alternative. So my advice here is definitely to always try to use and take that up in your procedures to use the more secure alternative if available. And so where do you apply that control plane filter? This is the single place where you apply a filter that would filter traffic which has a destination on the routing engine. So on loopback 0, obviously. But as we just said, although it is applied in configuration to loopback 0, it is in the end executed at different levels. So in the down left side, you see the ASIC level or the packet forwarding engine, and you see that, for example, a classification of traffic or a configured firewall filter on loopback is applied on that level. At the line card level, there's a per application policer, also as I think yours explained, and Greg as well. That is where you police and classify BGP updates and this ICMP traffic I mentioned, etc. And obviously, if there are more line cards, then this applies to the other line cards as well. So just to quickly summarize what is applied where, as you can see, classification is could be done in the loopback filter, but is also embedded in the control plane DDoS protection. Policing, again, as mentioned, is user configurable. So if you configure a more strict policer than the one that is embedded, then that obviously will be used. And rate limiting, if you configure that in the loopback filter, is applied at ASIC level, and embedded DDoS protection applies rate limiters at ASIC, line card, and routing engine level. But obviously, there's always more, because there's not only the direct traffic that influences control plane, but there's other mechanisms, obviously, to overload control plane as well, or to maybe secure your control plane. It's a little bit more indirect maybe, but obviously apply RPKI. And there's a whole book about routing security as well, what you should do, what you can do. And there's a little scoop in here. We finally built the code after 10 years that the RFC was done to replace TCP/AO. Big thanks to Greg Hankins as well for that, and Cisco did that as well. So if you run BGP with a Juniper, a Nokia, or a Cisco box, you can finally replace MD5 with TCP/AO. Here's some resources. There's a whole day one book specifically written for just securing the routing engine. O'Reilly has a very nice article in a book they did on the Juniper MX. And there's a few links on the control plane and DDoS protection, where you can find the knobs you can tweak and the do's and don'ts as well. And that's it for my part.
Thanks, Melchior. Good news on TCP/AO there. Thanks very much about that. And also from Joris, good news about RPKI on Arista. Thank you very much for that as well. Funnily enough, there haven't been any questions coming in during your presentations, except for the one asking, why do network vendors always put so much information on the slides? But I can answer that one for all of you. It is because we asked you to do this in 9 minutes, in 9 slides. So that's why. Fortunately, I have some questions myself. Melchior, you mentioned that there are some built-in rules as well as the rules that you can apply yourself via firewall filters. Greg, does the same apply to Nokia? Do you have built-in filters that would kick in even if you don't configure anything?
Yes, I didn't mention that in detail, but a lot of the mechanisms that I mentioned on the summary slide are just enabled by default. So you don't have to think about them or turn them on, or it just runs automatically. So yes, for sure.
Yeah, because from an operator perspective, those things could be either a blessing or a curse. I don't actually know, so it's good to hear. Maybe Joris,
Yes.
do you have feedback from Arista on that one?
Yes, exactly the same answer. Like the default control plane policing ACL that I showed, and also the BGP ACL are enabled by default. But for the in-ASIC application, you have to turn on a separate feature.
Yeah, because I've seen in the configuration example that Greg showed about BGP neighbors that have been configured and those that have not been configured. I love that, and I see from the apply path word, I think where you got the idea. This is a very interesting bit of configuration to put in your router, and I would tell everybody, please make sure that you do something like this. And also, Melchior mentioned a hardening guide that has been written for Juniper. Greg, you also have some documentation on how to point people into the right direction there?
Yes, we do, and I mentioned it briefly as a teaser, but we have a new guide coming out this October that will go into much more detail than the documentation does.
One more question came in, but I'm not sure if it is a fun question or a real one. So let me just skip it and leave it for the bar. I have one more myself. Joris, you mentioned that some of the stuff is done in hardware and some is done in software. And I was just wondering, and this is maybe also a question for Melchior and even for Greg, I was just wondering if there is even a difference anymore these days between handling this kind of thing in hardware and in software. Joris, take it away.
Well, it really depends whether you are getting like big ass DDoS attacks on your control plane or not. So I guess that's also the reason that this IntiCam feature was developed. Like, it wasn't developed for that no one really wanted it. But in general, I think the classification and per protocol policing in combination with regular kernel ACLing, so IP tables, well, at least for our software, does the trick really well.
Yeah. Melchior, I haven't given you any questions. Do you have any thoughts on the difference between doing this in hardware and software? I think on Juniper it's always in hardware, right? Because of the loopback address thing that the traffic goes through.
Well, yeah. So first of all, I think at one point you come to sort of a standard, right? I mean, we sort of face the same problem. So in the end, the way you solve it, and partly the devices at high level work the same, right? So, but yeah, I mean, for with regards where you apply filters, yeah. So we try to obviously stick as much as possible in the ASIC. First of all, because it's the first point you hit the device, right? So you try to stop the attack as soon as possible. But yeah, but it depends a little bit as well. I mean, ASIC can do obviously everything. So some things you need to do in CPU or x86. So it totally depends on what you want to filter and where. But I mean, if you're doing a queuing or policer on ASIC level for transit traffic, you can do it for routing engine traffic as well, right? So.
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely makes sense to stop an attack as soon as possible, but that goes in general.
Of course.
Yeah. So sorry. So maybe just to re-emphasize, so all this policing and stuff that happens in hardware before it hits the ACL is actually being done in hardware, also with Arista. So I'm not sure if I made it a little bit overcomplicated here, but just to get everyone on the same level.
Any
Depends
last
a little
words
bit
from
on.
Melchior?
No, I was just smiling, Niels, when you said what is done in software versus hardware. I think the distinction you can make is what's done in the forwarding plane versus in the control plane. I mean, because obviously the software runs on hardware. So we try and do as much in the forwarding plane so that the control plane doesn't have to do all that work.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you guys for your presentations and for making the internet a safer place to be, especially with RPKI and TCP AO getting implemented. That's wonderful news from all of you. So thank you very much and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah,
Cheers.
Thanks,
And then
everyone.
Bye-bye.
we're going to have another type of presentation because so far, well, apart from Bert, of course, with the salary talk, we've been doing some quite technical stuff in this NLNOG live event. But right now it's time for something more lighthearted, or maybe it isn't. I don't know yet. Job has a couple of very, very, very interesting guests that he just wishes to chat to. Job.
Thank you, Niels. So with me today, I have David Meyer and Dino Farinacci, if I didn't butcher that name. These are two people that have greatly inspired parts of my career, specifically IETF development. And if you look at their resumes, it is crazy. It's tens of RFCs, millions of lines of code. They developed interesting technologies such as GRE, multicast, Lisp, RPSL. This is still stuff that we use today in our networks, even though we're like 20, 30 years later. So what I hope to talk about today is how did things like multicast develop? What challenges existed at the time? How were the social or political dynamics? Was it fun to do, or was it a terrible project? So give it up for Dave and Dino. Thank you for joining me. So Dave, Dino, how did the two of you meet? It was not on Tinder or any of the modern day apps. It happened in a different way, I think.
Yeah, it was even before Orchid. There was no social media whatsoever. There was physical social contact. Go ahead, Dave.
I have some bad news. It was before the web.
Yes, this is true.
Quite a while. Yeah.
You wrote each other letters?
Well,
no, we used.
There was only 3 applications: FTP, SMTP, and Telnet. Just what the previous talkers said not to use, right?
No, but let me see if I can answer Jeb's question quickly a little bit. I was working as a network engineer at the University of Oregon. I got lucky and got involved. I'll just say this. Oh, first off, Joe. Thank you very much for having us and for your questions. It's quite a bit of fun, so thank you for that. I was lucky enough to get involved in this project in building statewide networking in Oregon, and it was during the ATM era. So it was an ATM network, and we did it in conjunction with US West. And what they wanted to do, being a LEC and all of that, they wanted to do the typical thing that telcos wanted to do with video and audio, which was run them over these highly QoS conditioned, essentially PVCs. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to run things over IP. And at this time, the M-bone was just becoming sort of a more something that the normal human could get at, right? And so we started building a lot of multicast infrastructure over the top of this ATM thing. We're just using the ATM as circuits. And so then I started going to the IETF, and one thing led to another, and I met Dino, and we did tons and tons of crazy things on crazy multicast things. This was in
So what was that
circa
first meeting like?
this would have been circa 1990 or 91 or something.
Right.
To think I was 5.
Probably before you were born.
So Dave, as Dave said, he was at University of Oregon. I was at Cisco writing code for iOS. And it was before I did data center stuff, which was later in my career at Cisco. But basically, Dave was, I wouldn't even say a beta site. He was really very early on taking images that were really just coming from engineers and testing it. And since he was so flexible in his attitude and willing to try things, and boy, I made him go through some crazy things. But in those days, the internet was a sandbox, and we were able to really, experiment quite a bit, try crazy things. And yes, we would GDB and breakpoint core routers in the middle of University of Oregon's network. I don't know how he was able to get packets to get around the points we were testing, but he did a lot of magic configuration stuff. But it was just, I mean, it sounds like the wild, wild west, but it was so fun. It was incredible the amount of learning we did in a short period of time. And, we didn't have chat groups. And I mean, it was, Dave, I think it was even before AOL Instant Messenger that we had these things. I think we were going back and forth with email. That was the only form. We didn't really do voice because we had, and let's see, did we have a screen scraping capability where you could, I think he just copy and pasted text into email, and that was the debug output, right? And we only had ftp.cisco.com, which is where I would put images and where he would pull them. So, I mean, people kind of work the same way now, but they use more modernized tools, which are way more efficient. But it really took effort by human beings to make this stuff work. Go ahead, Dave. You might want to add to that experience.
Yeah. So all of that, and a lot more. But I'll just tell you, just as an anecdote, the first time I ever went to Cisco, I think I was in building, wherever the EBC was. Maybe it was building 10, but I think it was before the numbered buildings, right? So wherever
building
the EBC
D,
was.
I think it was. Yeah, right.
Yeah, maybe building D. And so I walk in there, and this sales guy, who wasn't our salesperson, was this Merrill McAdams guy, who's just a legend at Cisco. But I walk in there, and there's this sales guy called Martin McNeilis, and I think he's at Arista right now. But he says to me, "Oh, aren't you that guy from Oregon?" And I go, "Oh yeah, yeah, I work with Dino." And he goes, "Yeah, I want you to work with us because, as far as I can tell, you guys will run any damn thing." And it was really, he was talking about, yeah, Martin McNeilis.
Okay, let's spill it.
Any
What was
damn
the
thing.
worst thing you ever ran that Dino created?
Oh my God.
Where do we start?
Worst isn't exactly the dimension. It's like how I think a better kind of metric would be something like, how long did it take me to recover from loading that code on one of my routers? And
You
sometimes
know,
it
it
took a
was one
while.
of it was one of the way the exchange worked, Job, was like, I can't figure out this problem, Dave. I have to give you some debug code, and it's going to crash. I'm warning you, and it's going to crash this way. And then Dave would load it, and he says, it didn't crash that way. It crashed some other way. And then we said, oh shit, what are we going to do now? And so I had to give him another image so it could crash the way I was expecting it to get the data that I was expecting. And that would go back and forth for all morning or whatever. But you know, we did learn things, and we were able to get there. Now, was it efficient? No, but you know, it was the only tools we had at the time. And you know, these were the days where, you know, I thought that, wow, we could build images and we could learn things really quickly. To us, that was fast. And now when you look back, you look 30 years later, it's just like, I can't believe we had the patience to do all that, you know? And this was me coming off of working on CDC computers where I was working in assembly language. So just the fact that I could write code in C and actually give somebody an image rather than wake up in the middle of the night and have to load something and get dedicated time on the machine. This internet thing was so cool because somebody could run new software. You know, we were on the same time zone. That was huge. Being on the same time zone was huge. But the fact that I could compile something, somebody else, somewhere else could pick it up and put it in a network, that was like way cool and super state of the art, right? Everything's relative.
You
And
know,
these
there's another
were
part of it
images.
too. Yeah,
These
yeah,
were images
images.
that were
Yeah.
like 20, 25 megabytes, and you were hauling them around
Oh,
over
bigger,
Yeah,
50.
right.
bigger,
Well, don't forget,
bigger.
it had all these things, all these protocols like Novell and Apple Talk and Banyan Vines. I bet you most of the people on this call doesn't even know what Banyan Vines is, right? So these were, you know, the cool thing about Cisco was it was truly a multi-protocol router, which means, you know, we had 6 implementations of a variation of RIP, the routing protocol, right? And we had 6 variations of trying to do the data plane at different levels, right, on the line card. Autonomous switching was microcode on the line card, and you know, all these different levels. So we kind of like implemented the same things over and over again. And then, you know, eventually the industry made Cisco engineering more efficient because everybody could then start working on IP because IP clearly won, right? So you know, so yeah, they were large because everything was static and non-linkable. But I don't know, Dave, how when I gave you a typical image, I mean, what were the link speeds at that time at Oregon where you could download stuff? I would say minutes you would get something, right? Not seconds, right?
Yeah, yeah, minutes, minutes.
Minutes,
But
yeah,
Job,
yeah,
we had a 56K 2 hops to the NSF regional in Seattle. Two
right.
56K hops. Um, anyway, one thing I wanted to mention, Job, is and you guys. Well, I'm not sure exactly, but I think a lot of you guys missed this, but there used to be something at the IETF and at NANOG and at RIPE called the terminal room. And in the
Oh
terminal,
yeah.
because there was no wireless. This is predates wireless. And so what we would
There's no
do is
terminals
by
nowadays.
yeah, well, this
Yeah,
predates wireless by a
right.
couple of decades, literally a couple of decades. By the way, we could tell a story too. The first time Dino ever saw wireless, I had one of the Steven Stewart deck roamabouts, and we were in a working group. I forget which one it was. I was sitting next to you, and I said, "Hey, Dino, look at this," because I had a wireless connection, and nobody else did. Steven Stewart went around and put these things in and all this stuff, and Dino said something like, "Wow, this makes the IETF useful finally. It actually work while I'm here." Anyway, I wanted to,
We were able to do debugging from the lobby rather than the terminal room, right? So
but but what I wanted to mention is this terminal room was a whole social event, and what would happen is, um, all of our ISP friends, and it was just the who's who of the era, right? And we'd all go in the terminal room after the, whatever, we're at the bar or whatever. And Dino would fix bugs late into the night for everyone who was in there. And there was this camaraderie around this that I don't know if that exists anymore because I'm not really, like kind of in the groove of that or anything. But it was a social event in the terminal room where we all worked on problems that we had or designs that we were interested in, And like I'd have code, hey, this doesn't work, and then I had to prove to Dino that it didn't work, but then he'd just fix it or make the feature, while we were there. And so that was one of the big losses that came with wireless. And when I spent a lot of time working in NLNOG, I tried to figure out how to recreate that, that whole scenario that was there, but it never really happened. Because I think that was like one of the most productive, periods of time where we'd get in there and we'd all just, do it.
I think nowadays in IETF context, some of this activity happens at the hackathons. It's the 2 or 3 days before the official IETF meeting, and its purpose is to facilitate interoperability and make it kind of a social thing. Get different vendors, different implementers at the same table, and be like, well, why is your software not reacting this way to this packet?
I don't remember if there were other implementers besides Dino in that scenario, because what I do remember so it predates Juniper. So who would have been the other router vendor? I'm not really sure. But most of the people who
Gate D.
Yeah, maybe
Gate D was the other router vendor. Yeah.
Yeah. And but most of the people in there were the ISPs from the large national backbones, because a lot of times we were working on multicast, not because I think Dino and I both. I mean, it was cool, like he said, it was fun, but the ISPs. I mean, you can see the attraction of it. If I could just at that time, bandwidth was really, really expensive. So the attraction of it was, oh, I can send one packet down this link. Hey, and exploded on the other end. Hey, that's a fantastic thing. And everybody wanted that, right? And because people were afraid of, I don't know if afraid, that might be too strong a word, but people were concerned about having multiple video streams going down one pipe like we have today, like with application layer multicast. And
but it
people were very concerned about it.
Dave, it was very much like things are today about peering, right? People only wanted one stream coming through their network, but somebody had to replicate the packets. So the different ISPs at the peering would say, just give me one packet and I'll decide if I replicate. Many times they would just send one stream through their autonomous system and want to push replication to somebody else, because the replication cost then was multiplying packets on their network. So, take the good and the bad or whatever. One comment I wanted to make about the hackathon versus what we did is the hackathon at IETF is really cool because it's people that are taking fresh ideas from newly written internet drafts and trying to write open source code. They are trying to do it for interoperability, but it's usually one implementation that everybody uses. In the older days, we had stuff called public domain code, and it was a reference implementation that people would take to build their own implementation and then market it and change feature, enhance it, and bug fix it a different way. So those two terminal room sessions, we were actually debugging code that was actually going into the production routers. It wasn't like a prototype or experimentation in trying to get things. So I think the hackathon is earlier in the development process where we had ideas and the RFCs were a little bit more established, and we were actually trying to get the code running in production because we needed more fundamental things to work earlier. So, but the great thing about the social aspect of the terminal room is like, oh, wow, while we're learning about these problems, there's these really cool features we could do. So let's get this operator, let's get this researcher, let's get this vendor together and co-offer an RFC. And those terminal rooms would produce ideas where the next terminal room at the next IETF, we would have implemented it. And we turned it around quickly. That was the key, is that, every 3 months we did last IETF's RFC or idea. That was what was really nice.
I got a question that may be hard to answer. What is the one RFC or internet draft you regret having written most?
MPLS. Sorry.
You mean
That
the
was
label
easy.
stack
You
again?
know,
But I know what you're getting at. Go ahead, Dave.
none. I mean, some of the, I mean, you know what I would always say about my writing in the IETF is, I prove that anybody can publish any kind of crap in the IETF. I prove that. But but I mean, it's like in those days, it was more about the network wasn't such a refined thing as it is now. It was more for me. I'll speak about me. I I just wanted to work with all these people. I didn't care what it was they were doing. It's like you get around somebody like Van Jacobson, John Crowcroft, Leisha, all these people, you just want to work with them, because you can learn so much just being around those people. And it was such like I think I told you yesterday, it was such a fortunate thing to be in that time and place where you could interact with people like Dino, Van Jacobson, it was just a fantastic experience. And so a lot of that stuff I worked on. I even worked on DNS for a while because I wanted to work with
What?
some of the DNS. Yeah, I did. Yeah, because I wanted to work with some of the DNS people and learn what they knew, which was substantial, I mean, about this. So, I mean, as far as, if I had to say what was the hardest one I ever wrote, maybe it's got to be MSDP because I could never figure out how DNS code worked. So I could never write what the algorithm was for pure RPF in MSDP. I just couldn't write it. I tried so many times. And I finally recruited Bill
Because
Fenner to try to
the
help me.
code was changing
And
weekly.
yeah, yeah. And I finally recruited Bill Fenner to try to help me. And between the two of us, we still couldn't do it. So the end of the MSDP story really never had a solid spec. And I'll just tell you, just to go way to the beginning of it, for people who don't know, probably everyone, there was an epic meeting at Cisco involving John Myler, Yakov Richter, Peter Lothberg, Dino, and me. And we were trying to, I think there might have been somebody else there, but maybe that was the whole group, right? And what we were trying to do is figure out how to do multicast peering. And we had tried so many different things, and like dense mode exchanges and all these kind of different things. And Peter Lothberg, what he said was, well, why can't we just have the RP tell everyone else where all the sources are? And that's the entire design spec for MSDP right there.
Yep.
One
So
sentence.
Joe, I'll answer your question the opposite way. What do I think is one of the most foundational RFCs that either one of us wrote? And I have to date it back a little bit later after we did the multicast stuff. Was Amsterdam, October 2006, Amsterdam routing workshop. It was an IB workshop on routing and how to save the internet and reduce the size of the routing tables. It was Dave's RFC that basically documented what went on and defined all the problems super clearly. And that was the basis for me and Dave and Vince Fuller and Daryl to build Lisp because we wanted to solve the routing table problem. And it turns out by building a level of indirection, we solved all these other use cases that we didn't know about or didn't think would be popular now, 14, 15 years later. So I thought that was a great RFC, Dave. And the thing was, since it was such an important problem, the IAB shot it through to RFC so quickly. That thing probably made it to RFC in less than 3 months. That's kind of unheard of, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Joe,
These days.
just as an aside on what Dino just said, and I want to just come back to the great fortune that we've all had being associated with the internet. When I was first starting out, we had this 56K it went to Corvallis where Oregon State is, and then Oregon State had a 56K to Seattle where NorthwestNet, which was our NSFNet regional, was, right? Well, the routers that were used in that network came from the NSFNet regional because of the way granting and this stuff worked, right? They had Proteons. We had Cisco. Oh, so Proteon might have been a competitor, Dino. Anyway, so we had
Oh yeah,
Proteons, and
absolutely.
when the Proteon booted, it did a lot. I mean, it did a lot of stuff. But one of the things it did when it booted is it said TCP/IP software copyright null Chiapa. So who's Noel Chiappa? I'm thinking to myself, and 20 years later, we're working on Lisp, and Noel comes into the little group, and I get this fantastic experience of being able to work with Noel, who's kind of an internet genius kind of guy, right? And it was fantastic just having him in there and getting his insight and all of this stuff. And if you like Lotus cars, he knows everything. He had like 20 Lotuses or something, but it was one of
So
these
Noel was
situations where just fantastic luck to come into contact with these people.
So Noel was one of those guys, we can call him a transparency guy, where he would write in real time on transparencies on overhead projectors. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, where these, Van would just get up and write code. He would create an algorithm and write C code on a transparency without smudging it up because there was no typos or anything like that. So
That's
Noel was
crazy.
in those class of characters where, as part of the IPv6, looking at all the possible protocols that could have been the next gen. We called it IPNG at that time, and IPv6 was the one that actually was selected. It was actually called SIP, or Simple IP, which was an 8-byte address turned into 16 bytes, and that's what we know as IPv6 today. But one of the proposals was by Noel, and it was called Nimrod, and it was a very advanced way of thinking about how to do the internet. This guy could probably implement or design an internet using a half a dozen different architectures and tell you the pros and cons of each one. And he was pretty emotional and passionate about during those days because he knew what could work and what needed to happen. And unfortunately, a lot of his ideas we could use today. However, the IB, the internet, the IETF, the IRTF wanted to take an incremental nature and just increase the size of addresses. And I know a lot of you guys probably will say, was it a good move? Was it a bad move? It's hard to say. It's been really hard to make IPv6 ubiquitous, even though it's better now than it has ever been. But could we were so worried about feature creep and second system syndrome that IPv6 was simply just an address size increase and really nothing different in functionality. And Noel just said we had to take a look at the routing architecture because the routing architecture is pretty much the same in IPv6 as IPv4. You push routes around with an IGP and a BGP type system. And so he was very instrumental in thinking that the internet needed a separation of addresses at these different layers. Because we all, let's face it, and a lot of people, internet people, don't want to admit it, we did learn a lot of interesting concepts from the OSI reference model and how each layer had their own set of addressing because it was abstracting out. And so we knew that the TCP/IP suite didn't have that and how we could fix that. But anyways, no, I'm glad you brought it up, Dave. He was definitely visionary and helped us in the early days of Lisp. And still, his name's on many of the RFCs that the working group's still working on.
Yeah, about larger address spaces, I am guilty of this as well. When large communities came along, there were competing proposals that allowed all kinds of features and flags and key value type things to be stuck in this wide community, and it would be, almost Turing complete. And I argued fiercely, it's like, no, we're in a hurry. We have 6 years to get this deployed in the wild. We need just larger space. That's it, nothing else. And in doing so, I also know that the next 20 years will be stuck with just a larger community that has none of the appealing features that could have existed, but we ran out of time. And it's
that's good insight. So
in the moment
funny,
that it happens, you're like, what are we going to do? We have to ship specs. We need to keep this internet thing running.
One of the concerns, though, go ahead, Dino. I'll wait.
I was just going to say, and we talked about this yesterday. Dave felt that we met because we kind of forgot how we met. Is that I was working on something called Tuba. A lot of us were working on something called Tuba. Tuba stands for TCP and UDP with bigger addresses. It was running the TCP/IP transport protocols and above the applications over CLNS, which was the network layer. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, we're during the IPNG days when we were on the directorate trying to figure out what to do, we wanted to use CLNS because the NSAP address was variable length. And variable length meant that the addresses could be smaller if you wanted them to be, or a maximum size of 20 bytes, right? And of course, we had, Dave, you probably remember this, but we had the router versus host wars, where the host vendors wanted fixed addresses in a certain place, and the router vendors wanted a variable length address as byte 0 of the network layer because we thought it would be easier to get memory into an ASIC-based forwarder much quicker. And so basically what happened was, what won was we knew 64-bit processors would be the norm and would be around for a long time. And as we speak today, 20 years later, we still aren't at 128-bit processors, or, if we are, we could actually put an entire IPv6 address today in a single CPU register. But we're not sure if that's useful enough because a lot of people use 64-bit addresses, the lower order 64 bits of the IPv6 address for doing host-based stuff. But anyways, the point here is that we tried a lot of different options and used different protocols, and it turns out that it was really a 64-bit address that we wanted to run with, and for political reasons, let's double it just to be safe, and that's why we have 128 bits.
Yeah, I remember
Go ahead,
that.
Dave.
Dino, I remember that guy, Danny, somebody from Sun. He was the guy who was pushing for during the IPNG. I'll think of it.
Danny.
But Job,
Okay.
Yeah, I'll think of it. I just wanted to mention the one thing that that happened around the time we were trying to do the, what should we do about the, it doesn't seem like people care that much about routing table sizes anymore. But one of the things that people were really concerned about, because in the Vince Fuller era or people like that who were very active in the IPNG thing, they were operators, but what they had was AGS pluses essentially. And so what does this mean? This means that the route processor has 16 megs. And, so every slot, and Tony Lee had a proposal, I think it was Tony Lee had a proposal, or maybe it was Sean Duran, one of these, or maybe both of them, had this proposal where they would charge for slots in the routing. So the ISP would just charge. If you're going to
that was
blast a
Sean.
lot of, yeah. And so there's a lot of stuff like that, but people were worried about, with IPv6, one of the big worries was not just the size of the routing table, but that it would be deaggregated in the same way that the IPv4 routing table was, but it would be worse. And this is why it would have been worse. I don't think this really developed or hasn't developed yet, but the way it would be worse is if you have a giant aggregate, that the fact that you aggregated it actually is an abstraction that hides all of the dynamic behavior of the network underneath it, inside the aggregate, right? And so now I have mobile IPv6 or whatever, and now I have all these 128s floating around everywhere, whatever they are, or just longer prefixes, whatever that, whatever the subnet mask is. So they're just longer
Punching
prefixes.
holes.
Yeah, punching holes, yeah. But all of these prefixes expose the dynamic aspects of the network that wouldn't have otherwise been exposed. So now, not only did you have a problem with how many slots do I have, that's not a problem anymore, but in the AGS era it was. Not only was that a problem, but now the CPU is at risk because now the route processor had to deal with the dynamic nature of the network that wasn't exposed previously to that. So that was one of the things that people were very, very concerned about.
Yeah, it turns out in terms of aggregation that a lot of organizations just want independence. And when it came to V4, they would keep adding more and more blocks, but they would retain one ASN. When it comes to V6, we see a little bit less deaggregation, but people still do it when there's independent sites. But if you look at the growth curves of V4 and V6, it actually seems very predictable. And the current hardware seems to be up to spec for, at least for the forwarding plane.
Yeah.
So when we thought about these punching holes and switching from one ISP to the other, that was actually mobility happening, but it was done statically. In other words, if you had two connections to different service providers, and either if it was a provider independent address or provider assigned address, you had to put a more specific into the other one. And what we said is that you had this address independence because if you switch providers, you wouldn't have to reassign the IP addresses at your site, and that's why we defined EIDs and locators. And it turns out that is mobility. That means you can actually move anywhere. But back then, it was moving a site to a new service provider. You physically weren't moving the addresses or moving the computers. Now, today's with VMs and containers, we see these systems popping up, and we want to identify them based on a service or something. And so now they're truly moving. And of course, with mobile phones, you feel the physical movement rather than a container has IP address 1111 somewhere and then it pops up somewhere else as 1111. That's a mobility event, but that's still very much like multi-homing. But when you have a phone that's moving around, that's multi-homed with multiple radios, then you really see this physical movement happening. And that's what the sort of things we use Lisp for today is real mobility, right? With shortest paths.
But
That's the key. Is that I have this presentation that's really cool. It's called Subnet Suck, and that we never need VLANs, and where you are is just some detail, like Ethernet is. Nobody really cares what an Ethernet address is. It just knows that you pop up. So having who you are is what's important. If you could define this service, this is why you want to have these sort of static EIDs around. Anyways, I don't want to make
by
this
the
a
way,
list commercial.
by the way,
What
by
happened
the
to the
way,
dream, though? You first, Dave.
What?
I just wanted to mention that this problem of punching holes and mobility, Noel actually solved this. This was solved in Nimrod.
Nimrod, yeah.
And this was one of the things, this was one of the features that really set a lot of people off and made it so emotional that this particular problem wasn't solved. And Noel actually had solved it and in a well documented way. I think there's actually even a textbook on Nimrod somewhere. So it was well documented and he solved it in a very elegant way. But like Dino said, it wasn't incremental.
Yeah, and nowadays we have clouds that were built by people that grew up in the IPv4 shortage, and we can now see massive layers of NAT in every virtual machine deployment of scale. It's so crazy that an inferior technology keeps being pervasive in
Well,
real world
I'm glad you brought that up, Joe, because this is a really good story. Going back to all the work Dave and I have done together. In the early days, we were out in front, the protocol designers, meaning we would design something and it was the NAT vendors that said, oh, this new protocol came about. We have to punch a hole or deal within a NAT device. It's now turned itself completely opposite, where now when I want to build a new protocol, I have to make sure it can get through a NAT. So now I have to put NAT traversal machinery into my architecture to deal with the single or double, triple NATs, as you're saying. It's really changed. And it's a dominance of deployment sort of thing, and how people kind of shuffle back and forth. And it says, no, you have to adhere to my architecture. No, you're building a new architecture that's brand new. You have to adhere to what's already out there. And I think the internet designers were much different than the OSI designers because we were practical. We had to get working with what was there. And trying to deploy Lisp on a network that already existed made us have to make really hard decisions. And people would argue they were non-elegant decisions, but we wanted incremental deployability. And how do you do that? How do you change the tires on the car while it's still running? That sort of thing.
You run really, really fast while you hold up the car.
Yes, yes.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So
I wrote a presentation. One thing, I just wrote a presentation for NLNOG once around the time when all this was happening, and it was carrier grade NAT, and I forgot what the scheme was that took some of the It took some of the bits from the port ID and, did all these crazy things, right? And I think I'll have to go find it, but I think what I called it was "It's the End of the World as We Know It." And on the cover of it, I had like Chicken Little watching the sky falling and all this stuff. But somehow it didn't happen. The sky did not fall. The internet's still here. It's still working. It's still growing. Somehow it has this resilience. And, that was one of the things I wanted to study with my friends at Caltech was where did this resilience really come from at some more fundamental level than just, the protocol design or something like that. But I never did that work. I was too lazy.
I mean, Dave, you bring up a good point, and maybe we should be intellectually honest and say if it wasn't for NAT, the internet wouldn't be as big as it is today. We really have to say that. And we were able to grow it, and we were able to use it in some weird ways that nobody predicted. But now I'm starting to think of the 5ESS sort of situation where AT&T built a phone switch a long, long time ago, hundreds of years ago, and it was pretty simple and it was managed by people, and then it grew into something that was completely unmanageable. I think Job and the current generation of engineers would say this network, yes, it works. It's kind of amazing how it was all put together, but the cost of managing it is just incredible, and we need to take a look at it all over again. And I don't know, hopefully IPv6 can be something that we say it will, IPv6 by definition, no NAT, no MSTP, right? These are important, attributes of this new architecture. So,
Job, you
even
probably
with
missed this.
IPv6, it took years before in the RIPE community you could get IPv6 space if you were single homed. So people would either ignore IPv6 entirely or use ULA space and NAT their provider managed space into their internal space to avoid having to deal with a renumber in 100 separate places and just in a few edge places. So I know that IPv6, some in the IPv6 crowd argued against NAT, but it didn't happen. NAT won.
But it also only, that scenario that you described works right up until there's mergers and acquisitions. And then it's like you had 1918 space and everything's screwed up. It's like
luckily the policies were
that's how the cloud networks run. It's all with 1918 space, right? So in fact, NAT is a perfect locator ID separation protocol, right? Because the EID is 1918 space, and the RLOCs are basically global addresses that are in BGP, right? We know that. We knew it all the time, right? So
I wrote this one RFC about complexity when I was working when I was at Sprint in the really early days of that, probably around 2000 or something like that. And in that has a whole thing about how what NAT is really doing at some fundamental level, and why, the question I had was, okay, we're in the internet space, the internet operators, or I don't know what to call them, so I'm going to say this, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but sort of the purist, no NAT, right? We can't have NAT, that's impossible, end to end, that's it, right? And, it's sort of democratizing, and there's all kinds of reasons why. But it turns out that NAT does this really interesting thing, and that Dino was kind of alluding to it, of coupling this process of coupling the sort of the inner addresses to the outer addresses, and that coupling, that process of doing that is what causes the management headaches that Dino is talking about. You just have to back it out a ways, but you find it if you do it.
So
and then you can have carrier grade NAT and make it 100 times worse too, if you like.
So for all the young engineers that are listening now, and I like to get Job's and Dave's opinion about this, is when we started, we all had mail servers and DNS servers, and it really felt like a peer-to-peer network, and that not all our packets were going to these monopolies and stuff. There's this blockchain talks about this decentralization. Now everybody could run the network together and we could be one happy family. We did that in the early days of the internet. Decentralization was there by default. And we've evolved where it's not that way anymore. It would be nice if we can get back to that point where there's more independence and freedom, democratization, decentralization. Dave, do you have an opinion about that? And Job, I'd like to hear what the current generation of the internet is doing, or do they even care about that?
So I'll go first, Job, and then
Dave?
you go, okay? So just to put a little bit more color on that, what we did was everybody had a T1, everybody had a router in their own house, everybody had their own address space, and everybody had an AS. And, you know, T1 would go to different places. Fortunately for me, I had built a sort of a local internet exchange at the University of Oregon. So I just slapped a router on that thing and then made a little ISP for all my neighbors, you know, or, well, it was for Lucy, Hans, and Joel, if you know those guys, those people. But in those days, we built like little ISPs, and they were at your house in order to do this, you know, a lot of this debugging and development. And you know, in the early days, of course, we did it on, you know, like Dino and I did it on the U of O network. But later on, we had T1s, and we were, you know, in those days, having a T1 was like state of the art, you know. And there's still a 25 pair cable tacked to the side of my house that US West put there that's, you know, completely dead. But there's a Westel in my basement and stuff like
That's
that.
museum material. You better keep it there.
Yeah, how do we get back to decentralization? If we look at resources available to younger engineers these days, you can get the ASNs for basically free. IPv6 space costs $50 a year. You can set up peering fairly cheaply, depending on your exact geographical region. But I think where a lot of eyes need to focus right now is the centralization that exists or manifested itself in the 5 RERs taking on RPKI cryptographic functions. And I think for decades, the RERs have done a wonderful job of avoiding assigning duplicate ISP space to different entities. I think globally unique space is an important quality of the internet. But then how do we safeguard that? And as a naive solution to this is a single source of truth, which is then hidden in a PKI. But is that robust? Is it robust enough for the years to come? Are we going to see a model where multiple cryptographic entities start co-signing things and then that you get weight levels of... I don't know. We're in the very early days of this technology, and I think the technology itself is not inherently centralized. There's a lot of flexibility in how it can be distributed.
So Job, you just said how you could do it with today's tools. Maybe the first question to ask is, do you want it? Do you have a desire to be decentralized? And the reason I'm asking that is because when I work on stuff now, people care about privacy in so many ways, but it's usually the 40 to 70-year-olds that want to do it. And like the Gen Zers that are coming up in a society where they have no personal privacy and they don't care about it because that's all they know, and they're not asking for it. So I'm wondering, building the internet in a general way, not just at the router level that you talked about, is decentralization desired at all? Is the internet okay the way it is in terms of services and things?
We got to ask younger people. It's not us. All right.
Right.
I'm being signaled from the production room that we have overrun with a few minutes. I want to offer you both 2 sentences to say hi to the crowd, and then we're gonna end this conversation. Dave, you go first.
2 sentences, huh? Well, I guess
topic.
The first one is thank you guys very much for having us, all of you. It's been great being here, and thank you, Job, for arranging this. And also, thank you, Dino, for doing it. It's been great talking with you. I haven't talked with Dino in a little bit, so thank you.
Yeah, I think this meeting is going to help us get together more. So thank you, NLNOG, for reacquainting Dave and I again. That's great. And yeah, I'd like to echo the same comments as thanks everybody for listening. And we are resources. I still do a lot of work, and we're here, and we have a lot of experience to share. So you guys could just send me an email. I'm available. You don't have to go to some second tier website. Farinacci@gmail.com. Send me an email if you want a question answered or you need help. We're here to help, and we want to make your jobs easier. We want to tell you to make new mistakes rather than the mistakes we made, right? So we're available.
What are the
At least
chances?
I'm available.
Oh yeah, me
All
too.
right.
Now,
I'm going to make
if
sure we
anybody has the
just put
courage,
I'm going to make sure we put your email addresses on the website. And thank you for
okay,
this
that's
offer,
great.
because I mean, I literally myself rolled into IETF by emailing you guys and being very surprised I got a response back from these highly respected individuals on the other side of the planet. So yeah, awesome.
We're all
Gentlemen,
engineers, right? We're trying to solve problems.
thank you so much for your time. This was fun. I'm now going to kick you off the stream, and we're going to go to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Jared March. He is based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is very, very far away from Amsterdam. And it used to be impossible to have any meaningful video chat with Jared because he was behind a terrible internet connection. Luckily, he managed to solve this himself, and in this presentation, he's going to outline how he put children to work and how he dug fiber to his town. Jared, if you're on, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, I hope you all can hear me, and everything is great. And it's very interesting because I used to email and communicate with Dave and Dino back in the days, and with Dave Myers going and commenting and saying, he took the Oregon Internet Exchange and hung a router off it and built access to his neighbors is very hilarious to me, because that's really originally where I started, hanging off a T1 and doing stuff. So yeah, I had to start a telephone company, to go and get internet access to my house, especially internet access that was high speed, in these days. So quick background. Back in 2002, I moved to this nice house out in the country. T1, I had a T1 from my service provider, and a meg and a half was really a great internet connection. And around the city of Ann Arbor, there's a lot of development going in and stuff like that. And I sort of expect, I moved out there kind of expecting, at some point, broadband was going to reach me, because that was in the, kind of a little bit in the post DSL started to launch. I was expecting, cable services to kind of expand out to me and stuff, but nothing came. And so, the existing services, they were about, 2.5 miles or so away from my house. So where do I live? West side of Ann Arbor. No, you got to keep going further west. And then, really, I live next to a farm, and I've gotten to know all the farmer neighbors in the past year as well. So, I live out here in this little, that little untitled place mark here. And you can kind of look and see, as I go through the years here, what some of the development kind of popped in. So in the upper left, there's going to be a neighborhood that pops in. You kind of see it growing in, over time. This is off of, historical, Google Earth images. And you see these neighborhoods, and developments pop up. There's another one popping up in the upper right as well. And kind of over the years, you can see this development, kind of popping in. So I've got this problem, conflict. So what do I do? Am I going to move? In the U.S., when you're buying and selling a home, the seller pays a commission. So I would lose some percentage of the value of my home when I sell it. And what did I find? I found a wireless ISP, to rescue me temporarily for probably about 10 years. So what did I do? I literally had to start a telephone company, contact lawyers, file a tariff. It actually was a lot easier to do than you would imagine. It's $50 to form the company. It was $1,000 to get a tariff written. And then, hopefully I'm going to profit from this. We'll see how that goes. So backing up, what did I have to do? Lots of research, planning. You have to figure out how to finance it. You got to pre-build stuff. You got to acquire customers, acquire internet access, deal with construction, contractors, and then get your fiber. Get the fiber. So research on access costs. I put a screenshot here in the upper right, in the lower right, showing this screenshot I took 2 days ago off the website of the incumbent. It shows the high-speed services that they about 3 or 4 years ago decided to launch in my area. From this, for $40 a month, I can get 1.5 meg service. There's what technology I'm using. I'm using a mix of active Ethernet plus GPON, and then tons and tons of marketing. I got to talk to all the people, talk to many ISPs about doing existing fiber to the home. I got a lot of information from them and talked to a lot of the community groups. Planning. So I had to, I purchased a fusion splicer. I purchased fiber back, several years ago. Purchased an OTDR, and then spend a whole bunch of time, design and permitting. Drew up the master plans, got the tariffs done. I joined the system, so when you're going to dig in some property, you get notified. You have to come out and mark all the utilities. Went and asked for the permit. And it took several months to do that. And last September, almost exactly a year ago, I actually got my permit issued to me, and I had because of the time of the year and the fact that here, it snows and such, it really pushed the construction schedule into 2020. So the financing of it. One of the things that was really important for me was to spread out the costs over, a longer period of time. I found distributors to sell me equipment, and I spent, money over the course of about 4 years, 4 or 5 years to kind of do this. My original planning for the project was like, hey, it's going to be about $60,000. Had to line up money, from bonuses, home equity line of credit. Customer payments and stuff to basically have access to paying for things. And I copied a prepay model from an existing ISP who had experience with it. So if somebody wanted the service, and I received checks from multiple people who would be willing to do this, they were willing to spend $5,000 up front to go and pay me to offset, my initial build costs. And, it keeps the customers paying something for the service, although it's a reduced amount, but, they get a service credit for a number of years. So yeah, I spent the past couple of years going out and actually doing pre-builds, connecting people up. I worked with my existing wireless ISP. I said, hey, I'm going to run fiber to all my neighbors because I was hosting the hub for access to their homes. I pre-wired them all at my expense. Did all the construction, got racks in my house, fiber distribution patch panels. You can see a photo here of, the incoming fiber and, panel into my house that goes to a 24 count cable that goes out to the road, and all that. I started to get everybody hooked up. And so, what's a person to do? I don't have a big truck. I don't have stuff. The people at my distributors completely had a crack at me pulling up in a little Prius. And buying equipment, materials from them, and loading it up. And I just spent a whole bunch of time working on customer acquisition. Our local area has this tool called Map Washtenaw. I live in this place called Washtenaw County. I can look at the shapes of the property, find out who owns it, and I went and I sent them a letter in the mail on paper, and people actually did respond to these things. It really worked out well. I got invited to neighborhood meetings. I sent everybody a letter once construction was starting and said, hi, by the way, construction's starting. And during the construction process, I got additional people to sign up. I got actually about 70% of the homes that construction was passing to sign up through the process of it because of the low speeds and options available out here. So I line up internet access. I got internet access from a local company called ACDNet. I have a redundant connection currently pending from 123net. I'm going to connect to the local internet exchange. And I actually managed to get IP space from Aaron. So I applied for my V6 space first, and Aaron has a program whereby which if you have V6 space, you can also do V4. And I happen to already have an ASN hanging out. So I was able to go and use that. So you line up contractors, you get the contractors going. This is them. This is one of the utility companies, the contractors working, finding a very large, about 18-inch, about half meter or so gas main that they had to bore past, out here in, nearby my house. But you have to go and, take care of the contractors, make sure that they're able to keep working. And you can see, in these COVID times, people wearing masks and covering their faces while they're working on this stuff. One of the things I experienced was, you need to make sure that with your contractors, you've got policies around things like social media posts and stuff like that. So expect lots of problems if you're going to undertake a project like this. There's this corner, which is really the most complicated, and I call it cursed at this point, because a contractor, they lost the drill head for their directional drilling machine in that corner, and a lot of the utilities here were really installed in an interesting fashion, which made it very difficult. The green lines are actually my lines as of one point, and for a short distance, 100 meters or so. This was really the most difficult part of it. It took them 3 tries to actually get this bored correctly, and just because of all of the different challenges we faced there. And the existing utilities did not mark them very well, which made things really difficult. So what equipment do I have? I actually purchased a directional drill machine. It was actually very inexpensive, I think, in the big picture. It was about $8,000 to purchase that. And so I can actually use that to go do things. And the wireless ISP that I use, they actually purchased a cable plow for burying the service drop cables. And so this machine is really nice. You just can drive it along and bury the cable, and it just leaves a little slit in the ground, afterwards. When you talk about problems, one of the things that happened is we had to work with the police. We actually had one of the machines disappeared from one of the sites, and we found it. We actually found it for sale on Facebook, and we managed to recover it as well due to diligent work on the part of the police, and then our own research and going and finding this equipment. And you can also see the challenges. Thankfully, this photo is interesting. It shows kind of how I damaged my yard, but this actually turned out to be one of the best pictures we actually had of the piece of equipment to go and show the police. So documenting some of the stuff that you have is really important. We also received a stop work order in the middle of the stuff. There's a bunch of details, regulatory issues, in building the projects. And so, we had issues around staking the right of way. We weren't notifying the county to their satisfaction that we were out there actually working on things. And so this was something that, we had to go and work through and resolve the issues related to that to get them. Had these unbudgeted costs. I had to survey and stake the right of way. That was an additional $5,000 in expenses, and then also had to go and take that conduit and go and run, a tracing wire through that. I had to print up employee badges. It was really helpful during COVID-19, and also had to go and purchase water. I had to do some logistics for my contractor, and had to spend $1,500 on a deposit for a water meter for the directional drilling machine, because there's no public water services out in my area. So they could go and pick up water for that. Other problems, if you actually go out and look, the tape measure is measured in inches, but the existing cables out there from the utilities, they don't mark them well. They also don't bury them very deep, and so you can find them pretty easily. You also have issues where you can go in pretty easily with a drilling machine, wrap the drill head around your own conduit when you're doing work, and end up having to go and patch that as part of it. So you have to you have to really expect these problems and have solutions for many of these things. I'm now I'm much better at repairing somebody's telephone line than I was previously. I have all the materials on hand to do that. When I cut them, this fiber reel on the left here, you have to get the stuff installed. This was a 20,000 foot, fiber reel. So divide by 3 for your meters. And when you're out there, literally next to the cornfield, and you realize I have used 20,000 feet of fiber as part of this project, it is really, a lot of stuff. I also don't know what it is in centigrade, so you'll have to do that. But you end up renting these air compressors for doing stuff. I built my own fiber blower as part of this process, and you end up hooking this stuff. I was able to blow in the fiber, just short of a kilometer in the conduit, actually, without any issues. Once we figured out how to properly lubricate the inside of the conduit and everything, and had the right tools, really worked well. So what happens after you get the fiber in? You have to go out and splice. It's splicing time. You go up, you show out, you have to dig up all your, you have to open everything up, get your fiber out. You got your beverages, you have all your materials, and you start working. I'm literally out there doing this, with buckets for chairs, and just working as hard as I can to get things ready to get online, because this has been, somewhere between a 5 and a 10-year project, trying to figure out how to get this all done. Once you have the fiber up, you need to use the right materials, and you go back and you check your splices. If anybody here understands how to read OTDR trace, you can actually see this is not a great OTDR trace. And so you go and have to then go and say, okay, let's go out and fix it and make it better. You can get it better. Sometimes when you've got a cheap Chinese splicer, you're not going to get it perfect, but you can get the shape looking a lot better, and you can get so don't have so much loss that things don't link up. So, like all things with an ISP, you get a scheduled install date. You go, you do that. I know what I'm doing. I've been in the industry for roughly about 25 years, starting next week of being paid specifically to be in this. And I know what I'm doing. This should be really easy, right? You go, you sort through things. Of course, they're going to show up with optics. They actually asked me if I would be willing to put a 6500 in my house as the CPE. I politely declined a 6500 and asked them what other options we would have, because that would have doubled the electricity consumption for my entire home. But then after all that, eventually you get to the point, link up. Oh my goodness, how amazing this was. This is properly in UTC, and so it has been just under a week that this service actually has been up and working. You go, you get the service up, and it's really, really amazing. So you go and you look, hey, what were my ping times before? It was 30 seconds or 30 milliseconds, to go and ping roughly. What's it now? You're down in 8 milliseconds, significantly improved. You do a trace route, you go and say, hey, I want to trace route to my machines. Everything looks great. and then you check your smoke ping graphs, and this is when I actually started to transition traffic a couple hours later, over to the link, and you can really see the difference. The jitter's down, the latency is much better, and such. And I've got better graphs for this, now. And of course, you run a speed test. This felt really great because this, when you're getting 700 megs, on a connection that, previously you were getting, 20, 30, through the wireless ISP. And then at peak times, it was even slower, during the day. It really makes a difference. One of the things you notice when I took my IPv4 space and I was announcing it on a VM, to kind of hold it up, I actually got a call right before we got BGP up on this new link from a IPv4 broker. And they said, hey, we noticed you stopped announcing the space. And they were interested in trying to see what I was doing. Cogent, they're still trying to get me to sign up with service. They called me while I was taking a nap on my cell phone. And in the past week they sent me stuff saying, hey, we're ranked lower on down detector, than other people who may have had networking issues in the past week. And of course, Hurricane Electric is out there trying to sell me transit too. Considering how hard I had to work to get this local loop, it would have been great if we could have, done something before, but I don't think they quite realized the effort that I had to put into to getting to the point where I'm connected to a service provider. Of course, you're wondering, what are the costs? I was originally guessing $60,000. Just this year, I've spent just over $126,000 on this project. About 95,000 of it is to my directional boarding contract. That was a significant amount of money. You've got, miscellaneous materials, rentals and stuff. And this is just the 2020 costs. I had costs I incurred in 2019 with materials and stuff. Maybe it's still cheaper than moving, but at the same time, now I have fiber to my home, which is, I think, something that not a lot of people have. The other thing, really important, thank you to all the people. I bugged a lot of the local people who undertook projects similar to this. Wireless ISPs who went into the fiber business. I can't thank people like Ryan Peel, Chris Fabian, Antoine Parks, the existing wireless ISP, Roy Grove enough. All my neighbors who, believed in me and counted on me, people who gave me checks, contractor for doing stuff, and just everyone. I would send out, project updates every 2 weeks for people, letting them know this is where we are. And I would get these encouraging emails back. Thank you, and thanks, of course, to ACD and 123. Without them, I wouldn't have, the internet access and connectivity. And my family, my kids out actually going and helping me unreel the fiber. All that, I have friends and friends who came out and helped as well. Really, it was a much harder project than I imagined at the outset, because you go, you get contractor, they install the conduit, you blow the fiber in real easy. I'll tell you, I spent over a month trying to get the fiber into the conduit, and that really, that really posed some challenges for getting stuff going. Some additional resources. There's actually some great Facebook groups where people talk about this stuff. Where they go and say, this is how to do it. There's people, in global communities who are part of this. So it's not just, US, even though some of the groups are a bit more US centric. You see people around the world posting, in these groups, and that's really it. I'm happy to take, questions and stuff. I think I went a little bit faster than expected, with my slides, but this is what I could put together in the past week. I'm out splicing fiber and trying to hook people up in all the spare time. And like I said, I've been up less than a week. And so trying to get Job, of course, harass me and harangue me. Hey, can you put this together real quick? And so this is what I was able to do.
Thanks for a great presentation, Jared. Can you hear me? I'm afraid that because of the lack of earbuds, there may be a problem with you hearing me. Can you hear me now, Jared?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Great, thanks. Jared, the amount of admiration that you have received during your talk on the IRC channel and on YouTube is enormous. Many people have watched your presentation, and I'm sure that many of them have been dreaming about doing this, and you have done it. This is so wonderful. Can you just describe that moment when that link light on your Arista first came on?
Well, there were a number of challenges in getting that link light turned up, because it took about a day and a half to troubleshoot with the ISP. It turns out they handed me the wrong optic, which is, because I'm going into their DWDM system. I'm actually still currently up on a temporary optic. They dropped off the correct optic. It's actually behind my back here, so we're going to have to hot cut the optics on both ends of the fiber at the same time to get things going, probably next week. But it felt really great to have it up and working. When you go through and you've invested this much time and energy and getting up early in the morning, as soon as the sun is up, before meetings, going out and building splice cases, which really takes the majority of the time. The splicing actually is the quick part, but getting the cables nicely dressed and labeled and marked up and making the plans of which strand splices to which, and making sure that you're all set with the right splicer, the strands, the pond splitters, etc. It's still an ongoing project. I have people where I pre-wired them in the spring, and I really need to get out and get them hooked up. I've actually received one text message from a customer while I've been giving this presentation saying, "Hey, I thought we were going to get hooked up this week. What's up with that?" So there's a lot of details still to go, and so I'm still quite stressed out about this, just because there's a lot into it. And so now I have the connection up. Now I need to go and get everybody hooked up, and get them the services that they're expecting, including these people who were so generous and gave me money to kind of help offset the costs along the way. So it really feels great. It's going to feel even better once I have the redundant connection up, and I'm hoping that gets done soon.
Speaking about money, if you factor in the man hours you've put into this project, what would your cost estimate look like then?
So I can break down a lot of the costs. So some of the stuff like the fiber installation and the conduit, because of some of the challenges I had, I went and approached contractors for doing that. That was going to be about another $1 a foot times 12,000, roughly 12,000 feet. So that would have been another $12,000 that was unplanned. My costs really ended up coming out right around where people were originally estimating them, kind of between $8 to $12 per foot for construction. I was able to do a bunch of that myself and save some money. But if I were to do this again, I don't know how much of those tasks I would do versus just outsource and let it be their problem. My contractor had equipment breakdown, and losses associated with that. And so it was, 1 week I know they got exactly 0 feet of conduit installed. And they were out 3-4 days that week trying to get stuff done, just because, it's a mechanical piece of equipment. It breaks down just like servers break. Anything with spinning or moving parts can break. So there's a number of challenges there.
Some techies have obviously been asking, now that you have dark fiber to your home, what are your plans to upgrade your service to 10 gig?
So my service contract is for a 1.5 gig connection right now on a 10 gig. And so right now I'm currently up on a 1 gig optic because of a mix up with the service provider and the tech and such. There's also currently a 10 dB attenuator in the path that needs to get removed. And so thankfully there's a significant link margin, significant margin on the path on their side. So, that needs to get removed. But the next thing that's going to happen is I think on Wednesday we're going to simultaneously swap those optics and go and get services kind of up at 10 gig, and then and then I'll be in much better shape. The highest service speed that I'm currently offering is 500 meg service, and that is really it's 500 symmetric because why not? Because the upload is currently not very not very much used, and so I'm looking for the future things. The big thing for me is really having redundancy, because after I got the link up, there was actually a fiber maintenance. I think it was Sunday night, Monday morning as well, and so I actually failed back over to the wireless ISP for a couple hours during that fiber maintenance.
So how many houses, how many customers do you have connected right now? And what are people saying about that service?
I have about 17 people hooked up right now. And as soon as I got things transitioned over, I sent text messages to my neighbors. I said, hey, run a speed test, or hey, check it out. And the very first positive response I got basically went, holy moly. This was from somebody who is a doctor who's been out working very hard during these COVID times and such. And this really helped him out, and the ability to transition him off of the CGN that he was behind to a public IP on his service made a difference for him, because then his VPN started working much better as well. And so he's able to get in and spend more time with his family at home, because he has 3 children that he's adopted. And so the ability to impact these people's lives is really one of the rewarding pieces of this, because without this, a number of us, our homes, who would, I talked about maybe I should move to get this. Like, who would buy a house that doesn't have high-speed internet in 2020, especially, after all the different lockdowns and experiences that we've had. So, it was really, really fortuitous that this year was the year that this got done, because I think without that, it'd be much harder.
Yeah, something about clouds and silver linings. Yeah, I don't know if you heard my first remark just after you finished your presentation. There have been dozens of people showing their admiration for your project. And so many of us have been dreaming about doing this exact thing, and you've done it. And as I understand, it also has a very big impact on Ann Arbor as a community. And you must be sort of a famous person there right now, I guess, if you cannot just walk down the street anymore. You have made a true impact on the town. Can you just describe what it means for Ann Arbor?
So like I said, I live out far west, so I'm really more local to a small town, or it used to be a village, and it's now a city called Dexter. And so for the people around Dexter, and in the entire kind of county, which includes Ann Arbor and a couple other communities, I've become kind of the local expert in where all the fiber is, who the small ISPs are that can connect people. And so when people are posting on, the community Facebook groups and saying, all right, my kids are starting, school or something, I'm telling them, okay, yeah, go contact, the folks at the Webster Broadband Cooperative, or go contact Rural Reach, who's one of the other wireless ISPs in the area. Go contact, the people in Sylvan Township, the broadband committee. So I'm in close contact with many of the people, and trying to help and trying to give them good advice along the way, because I can't do this all. This is a lot. This is a lot of money to go and invest, and I've been trying to share my knowledge and experience with everybody along the way. So like the Webster Broadband Cooperative, I'm helping them, with, here's my distributor, here's who I buy stuff from. They're going to be wiring up a neighborhood this fall that has no options for high-speed internet access. And so they're going to be doing their own version of the construction project. And I've gone and I've said, here's fiber, here's the splicer, here's the materials that you need to buy to go do this. And a lot of the stuff, if you're doing a short distance, it doesn't matter if your splice is from a bad, cheap Chinese core alignment splicer. It does the work. You go on Amazon, they're like $800, $900. And so what if you have a 3 dB hit because you did a horrible splice because you're on 10-kilometer optics, and you're going less than a meter or less than a kilometer, and so it really works great.
Yeah, there is a technical question about the actual protocol that you use on the fiber. Did you consider using GPON as well on your network here?
So I have a mix of active Ethernet for everybody who I wired up originally to my house, and then right now I'm using the Ubiquiti OLT. So all the new people that are being hooked up are actually being hooked up on PON at this point. So that's what I've been doing and how I've been connecting everybody at this point. And I have more optics actually showing up today for the line side of the OLT.
Yeah, sounds perfect, Jared. Well, the number of comments about dreams and realities on both on YouTube and IRC is really overwhelming. I would invite you to take a look at what people have been saying about your project, because the feedback is absolutely great. You are an example to us all. So thank you very much for that presentation and fielding the questions that the people put up. It has been great having you here. Thanks very much, Jared.
You're very welcome.
And with that, I think we go back to Natalie for the closing words of this NLNOG live event.
Hi, everyone. Wow, that has been great. Amazing. First of all, I want to thank everybody for watching. We saw that many of you stayed with us throughout the whole event, so thank you. And of course, a big thank you to our speakers. It was wonderful to have a national and an international bunch of speakers from all over the place, from England, from the Netherlands, from the UK, from the States, everywhere. So a big thanks to them as well. We will work really hard to get all the videos as soon as possible cut up and on our YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch or send a video to your colleagues, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you get notified as soon as the videos are up. And then, of course, I can't leave you without thanking our sponsors yet another time, because we can't do this without them. So a big thank you again to Asteroid, Juniper Networks, RIPE NCC, M6, Solid Optics, KPN, NTT, Alterna, SpeedIX, PC Extreme, LoNapp, i3DNet, Duocast, NLNet Labs, Arista, NLEX, RETN, eBay Classifieds, Fusix Networks, OpenBSD Amsterdam, and Internet Society. We don't know yet exactly what we're going to do with the New Year's drink. Still fingers crossed. We're also looking at plan Bs. So stay tuned. Sign up to our mailing list if you want to know more. And now it's Friday afternoon, at least it is here in the Netherlands. So I would like to invite you to join us to the bar. The link will be put on the YouTube chat and also on the RFC channel. It is also on our website, the NLNOG Live website. So we hope to see you there for a quick chat with all of us. And see you next time. Thanks so much.